Hello, and welcome to this clean historical Western romance by Martha Gillcrest. It's great to have you with us. Before we begin, be sure to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple way allows us to share more heartwarming romance stories with you for free. Now get cozy, relax, and escape into adventure and love with a host of new characters. Enjoy. The following book is the copyright of Martha Gillcrest. A Bride to Save the Rancher by Martha Gillcrest. Chapter 1. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 1888. Do you want to help me, Poppet? Sadie Walters paused from kneading the dough for the bread she was making to accompany dinner and gave Morag a sympathetic look. I know what today is, and keeping busy is the best thing to do. Morag Kelly smiled at the way the family's cook had slipped into using the childhood term of affection for her, appreciating her kindness. I think the last time you called me Poppet was when I was about 8 years old. She looked out of the window onto their well-manicured gardens and sighed. I can't believe it's already been a year since Ma died. Sadie handed Morag her recipe book. Why don't you make a poppy seed cake in her memory? You know it was always her favorite. The two of them worked side by side companionably in the cavernous kitchen for the next hour, and before long, the scent of freshly baked bread and cake wafted through the room. Don't tell Papa I've spent the day in here, Morag said, glancing at the doorway as she put the cake on the side to cool. He tells me it's beneath my station to do jobs like this, but I enjoy it, and he barely notices where I am these days anyway, she added defiantly. A bit of hard work never harmed anyone. After all, it's what brought your ma to Mr. Kelly in the first place, isn't it? Sadie gave Morag a reassuring nod, so the young woman would know she would keep her secret. As the cook at Chesterfield Villa for over 25 years, Sadie was privy to the family's history and felt that it was a good thing to give Morag a reminder of the past in a way that Howard Kelly sometimes overlooked. A few minutes later, Morag poured out 2 cups of tea and placed them on the table in the center of the kitchen. Although it was only usually the maids who ate in the kitchen, lately Morag had taken to joining them as she found it more homey than sitting alone in the draughty dining room when her father was at the gentlemen's club. Will you tell me again about when Ma first came here, Sadie? You must know the story by heart? Sadie glanced at the clock on the mantel shelf. She still had a lot of chores to get through before lunchtime. But one look at Morag's forlorn expression swayed her decision. The chores could wait because Morag needed the comfort of friendly company today. Sadie was as fond of Morag as she had been of Orla, Morag's mother and the unexpected mistress of Chesterfield Villa, so it was no trouble to her. Start with when Ma first arrived, Morag said, looking wistful. Sadie took a long sip of her tea and settled in her seat, glad to take the weight off her feet for a while. It was a blustery early fall day, and Mr. Kelly, your pa, had been widowed for almost 2 years. She glanced at Morag, wondering whether she would mind her mentioning the previous mistress of the house, but Morag just nodded, happy that Sadie was sharing her memories. Go on, Morag urged. The master had already told us to expect a new maid called Orla. He said she had just arrived off the ship from Ireland, and we were to give her a room in the attic and help her settle into her job. I believe it was Orla's family who had mailed ahead and arranged for her to start working for Mr. Kelly as soon as she arrived. And what did she look like? Did she have other people traveling with her? Sadie shook her head. No, I have to say I admired her bravery. She came to America without any friends or family, and she was only 22 years old. I remember when I opened the door, she looked like a bedraggled scrap of a girl because it was raining. But after she'd had a bath and put her uniform on, she had beautiful copper-colored hair, just like yours, and the sweetest demeanor. Morag gave her a small smile. She knew she looked almost the spitting image of her ma, and it gave her some comfort. To think, I'm only 20 years old, and she did all that at practically the same age as me. I'm not sure I would be courageous enough to do the same. She might have been petite, but she was a plucky young woman, for sure. Mr. Kelly had mourned his first wife's death for over a year, but when I took Orla through to his study to introduce her to him, I could tell that she caught his eye. Of course, your pa was already in his 40s by then, but as you know, his first wife bore him no children. I think he was lonely, in spite of being a successful businessman. He often used to sit in his study by the fire in the evenings, and I used to think he needed the company of another wife. Of course, none of us imagined it would be his new maid who he would go on to marry. Ma was always very modest about her beauty and rather shy. It must have been strange trying to fit into a new way of life so far away from home. Sadie poured them a second cup of tea, noticing that Morag was starting to look more cheerful as they talked. I remember your ma threw herself into work. During her first few weeks, she often looked sad, but I'm sure it was because she had no family to turn to. She did tell me once that the old life back in Ireland felt like a dream sometimes, but her biggest fear was that she would arrive and discover there was no position of work after all. Sadie nodded. It did happen to some of the young women off the ship, and it still happens to this day. Many of them fall into hard times, living on the street and begging for money, but Mr. Kelly would never be so unkind. He had answered an advertisement offering a maid, and he honored his agreement with Orla's family. It was sheer coincidence that Molly Parker left her position the week before your ma arrived, and it was her job to lay the fires and dust Mr. Kelly's study. So your ma took over those jobs, and Mr. Kelly started talking to her about her home life in Ireland, and his interest soon blossomed into something more. Morag nodded, deep in thought. Mama said she was shocked that he even noticed her. In the previous house she worked in, they never spoke to the maids unless it was to give them an order. By comparison, she said Papa was kind-hearted and attentive. It was as if all his sadness was forgotten overnight, Sadie said. She pursed her lips slightly, remembering that she had felt a tad disapproving at the time about the way her master had pursued the new maid. She had assumed it would just be a brief dalliance. As was so common in the grand houses, where pretty maids were two a penny. But history had proven her wrong, and Mr. Kelly had wanted marriage, much to everyone's surprise. We used to hear him singing as he walked through the house, and all the gloomy rooms he had mothballed were brought back into use again. Your ma had a way of smiling at him that made him glow with pride. Morag chuckled. Mama told me that she could barely get a moment's peace to get her chores done. He wanted to know her opinion on all sorts of things and told her all about his business, which was more than she understood. He proposed to her by the end of her first week, which shocked us all. I do recall that she was worried about him being so much older than her. She felt she might not be sophisticated enough, what with thinking he was upper class. But your pa came from humble beginnings and worked his way up in the world. They were married within a month and spent many happy years together. Sadie reached across the table and squeezed Morag's hand. I know I should be glad that I had Ma for so long. I'm more fortunate than many, but I do miss her. Morag's eyes dimmed with unshed tears, and she stood up hastily, blinking them away. I must let you get on, Mrs. Walters. I know Papa will be cross if his lunch is late. Is there anything I can do to help? Look to the future, Poppet. It will be time for you to start courting and have a happy marriage of your own soon enough. Sadie pushed herself to her feet and bustled over to the range where the roast meat was almost done. If you could let Mr. Kelly know that lunch will be served at 1 o'clock as per usual, that would be a great help. Of course, and thank you for taking the time to reminisce with me. It means a lot. As she turned to leave, Morag considered Sadie's words and pulled a face. Do you really think I'll be courting someone soon? She murmured, feeling unsure of herself. Papa guards me like a bear watching over a cub on the rare occasions we go out. Considering he and Ma were so happy together, it's almost as though he doesn't want me to meet anyone. Sadie shooed her away. Of course you will. A pretty young woman like you. I shouldn't be surprised if there aren't already several suitable gentlemen waiting for your pa's permission to take you to a dance or the theater. She shook her head when Morag left, feeling slightly guilty about her hasty reply. Morag was certainly pretty, and no doubt there were acquaintances of Mr. Kelly's who would like nothing more than to get to know her better. But Morag was also correct in feeling he was trying to shut her away from the world. In truth, Sadie suspected Howard Kelly was afraid of losing Morag to marriage because he would be left rattling around the house all alone. It was a dilemma, and she hoped the master of the house would put his own needs aside to let Morag lead her own life. Morag walked slowly through the grand house, which had always been her home, trying to imagine what it must have been like for her ma to arrive as an impoverished young woman from across the ocean, expecting a life of servitude below stairs, and then find herself catapulted into being married to a wealthy, influential businessman within a month. Chesterfield Villa was a generously proportioned home in what she now knew was the elegant Georgian style, with tall, ornate rooms and extravagant furnishings. They had a smaller number of staff now, but she could remember the social events her papa had encouraged Orla to hold to impress his business associates, with the table groaning with food and maids bustling to see to their guests' every need. But all that had stopped when Orla Kelly became ill 2 years ago. "Sorry, Miss Kelly, I've just finished." Sadie's granddaughter, one of their few remaining members of staff, scurried past Morag, flicking a duster over the mahogany sideboard, snapping Morag out of her trip down memory lane. "I'm just going to see Papa about lunch. Is he in his study?" The young girl nodded, but looked worried. "He is, ma'am, but he's a bit under the weather." She gulped nervously and scurried away as though she'd said too much. Morag sighed and paused to look in the gilt-edged mirror that hung over the sideboard. She looked at her reflection with more interest than usual. All this talk of her ma was making her feel sentimental, and she leaned closer, noticing the smattering of freckles over her creamy complexion that never disappeared, no matter how careful she was to wear a bonnet in the sun. Her eyes were the same shade of periwinkle blue as Orla's, and she had the identical heart-shaped face as hers, too. The one point of difference was their hair. Where Orla's had been the color of burnished copper, Morag's was lighter, strawberry blonde. Orla had told her it was called, as she brushed it before bed every night when she was a little girl. Papa had wanted Morag to have a maid to do that task, but Orla had always insisted it should be her, saying that tucking their precious daughter into bed every night was one of her favorite parts of the day. "I miss you, Mama, but I know you're safe with the Lord and his heavenly angels, with no more pain now." Morag whispered the words and touched the locket at her neck that Orla had given her on her 16th birthday. Somehow it helped, making her feel as though her dear ma was not so lost to her after all. Turning away from the mirror, she sighed again and thought about what the young maid had just told her. Under the weather. That meant that Papa had been drowning his sorrows in the strong rye whiskey he had spent so many years making in the renowned Kelly's distillery. It was ironic that in all the years he had owned the business, he had rarely drunk the whiskey they produced. But when Orla died, everything changed. Almost overnight, he had turned from a kind-hearted, jovial man into a person she barely recognized, morose, bad-tempered, but above all, resentful that fate had dealt him such a bad hand to lose not one but 2 wives to illness that no amount of wealth had been able to prevent. Chapter 2. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. As Morag arrived outside her father's study, she was surprised to hear the sound of clattering from inside, as though he was opening cupboards and drawers looking for something. Usually, when he had drunk too much, he would stare morosely into the fire and then fall asleep. She hesitated on the threshold, wishing there was something she could say or do to ease his grief. "Papa, may I come in?" She tapped lightly on the door and waited for his reply. The clattering subsided, followed by silence. "Yes, if you must." The clink of glass indicated that Howard Kelly was concealing his whiskey bottle, but Morag was used to that. He still liked to maintain the facade that he rarely drank, even though his bloodshot eyes and slurred speech often showed otherwise. "Mrs. Walters wanted me to tell you that lunch will be served at 1 o'clock, as usual. She's done your favorite today, roast beef with potatoes and gravy." Morag glided into the study and went straight to the windows that overlooked the quiet, tree-lined street. "Shall I let some fresh air in, Papa? It's a little warm in here." Without waiting for an answer, she slid the sash window open, glad to release the sickly smell of stale whiskey that filled the room. "Whatever you want," he muttered. He threw himself into the comfortable leather armchair next to the fire and rested his elbows on the arms, steepling his fingers and looking at her intently. "I suppose you know what day it is?" Morag was startled by the hard edge of his tone. "Of course I do, Papa. I miss Ma dearly, as I know you do as well." She walked slowly along the bookcase, trailing her fingers along the spines of the books. Howard Kelly was a firm believer that self-education and hard work were what had made his business, the Kelly's Rye Whiskey Distillery, a success, and he had encouraged her to read as many of the books as she wanted with her governess. Orla had never been well educated, but Howard never thought less of her for it, and Morag had enjoyed reading many a gripping tale to her ma on a cold winter's night. "Do you remember how Ma used to gather us all by the fire so we could spend the evenings together? She said you worked so hard. She was very proud of you, Papa, always telling her friends who came to lunch how you bettered yourself to become a man of influence in the town." Howard grunted in a non-committal fashion, which wasn't the response Morag wanted. She hoped they could share happy memories of her ma, but he seemed determined to wallow in self-pity instead. She noticed it was always worse when he'd been drinking. "Shall we go for a walk this afternoon, Papa? Get some fresh air." "Haven't you got something better to do?" Howard snapped. "Something to fill your time, like the spoilt daughter of a wealthy father. An afternoon playing the piano, or stitching a sampler, perhaps." Morag frowned, feeling hurt by his implied accusation that she was lazy. "I would go out to work, Papa, but you've always told me it wouldn't reflect well for the only daughter of a successful businessman such as yourself to be working for someone else for money. You know I do my best to support your favorite charitable causes instead. In fact, I canceled a meeting with the church ladies about our fundraiser to be with you today. But maybe I should have gone." Howard's face darkened at her brusque reply. Usually, Morag meekly agreed to whatever he said. "I think you're getting above yourself, young lady." He jumped up from his chair and strode over to the table in the corner of his study, where he had several cut glass decanters of liquor on a silver salver that were there for when he entertained business associates. "Wouldn't you rather have a cup of coffee, Papa?" Morag said hastily, "I can run and fetch one for you. I'm sorry if I spoke out of turn. The anniversary of Ma's death is hard for both of us. I went through some of your mama's belongings early this morning." Howard sloshed a large measure of whiskey into a glass, not caring that it splashed onto the polished wood. Eyeing up the glass, he filled it higher and then gulped it down, gasping as it burned a fiery path down his throat. Morag wasn't sure what to say. "Did it bring you some comfort?" she asked hesitantly. She had been meaning to ask him whether they should pack away her mother's belongings in the last few months, but hadn't plucked up the courage. "Comfort?" The word came out laden with anger and bitterness. "Comfort is the last thing it gave me. It seems your dear mama was playing me for a fool all these years. I don't understand." Before she could finish speaking, Howard yanked the top drawer of his desk open and retrieved a bundle of letters tied up in a red ribbon. "Look at them. Unbelievable." He threw them angrily at Morag and paced back and forth behind his desk as she fumbled to open them. Morag pulled out the first one with trembling hands and started to read it, wondering what had gotten her father so irate. "My dear Orla, I miss you so much." She scanned the next couple of paragraphs, which were friendly, almost intimate in their tone, and then opened the next one. "Dearest Orla, I hope that you are well and happy in your new life here in Pittsburgh. I wonder if you think of our time together." Morag blushed, wondering why her papa would want her to read letters that he had sent her ma when they were courting, especially when they seemed so personal. "I'm not sure I should read your letters to Ma." Morag started to tie the ribbon back around them, but it only made her father angrier. "Read right to the end," he snapped. "Look at who they're from." Morag pulled several more letters out, feeling close to tears. "It says they're from someone called Liam Murphy," she whispered. "I don't understand, Papa." "Don't call me that," he shouted, thumping his fist on the desk. "How can you not understand when it's plain for all to see? I gave your mother everything, the deceitful wretch." Morag gasped. In all her years, she had never heard her parents argue, yet now her father was calling her ma these terrible things. Papa, please. How can you say that about Ma? It must be the whiskey. You need to lie down. Howard Kelly drew himself up to his full height and looked at Morag coldly, as though she were a complete stranger. Maybe you knew about her ungrateful lies, he said slowly. His eyes glowed with the fervor of a man who had uncovered a great injustice, and he took 2 long strides to her side, grasping her arm firmly. Come with me, and I'll show you if you insist on being so blind to the truth. He bundled her back out into the hallway. Papa, you're hurting me, Morag cried. His hand felt like a vice around her arm, but she was too shocked to struggle as he dragged her in front of the ornate mirror she had been looking into earlier. Can you see it now? He demanded angrily, glaring at their reflections. Morag wanted to shake her head and run away, but decided to humor him. She gazed into the mirror, taking in her papa's almost black hair and brooding brown eyes. He towered over her, and for the first time in her life, she felt afraid of him. I just see the man who is my dear papa, she said shakily. I forbid you to call me that ever again. Describe me, he added, squeezing her arm painfully again. You have dark hair and brown eyes. Correct. And what color are yours? Morag looked at herself. Strawberry blonde hair and blue eyes, she said quietly. Just like Ma, that's what you always said, she added, trying to raise a smile from him. Not exactly like your no-good mother, he hissed. Not now that I've read those letters. Your hair is too fair. You're no child of mine. No wonder she was so quick to insist that you were born early when you arrived 8 months into our marriage. Morag's eyes widened with shock. She had always believed that being born early, but having no poor health as a result, was a miracle, and it was what Howard had always claimed too, grateful that he had finally been blessed with a child. But now he had drawn her attention to the glaring differences in their looks. It was as if everything she had ever known to be true was being shaken to its foundations. Howard Kelly believed he was not her father. Orla deceived me for our whole marriage. All I represented was legitimacy for her terrible deed. Liam Murphy, whoever he is your rightful father, and I want nothing more to do with you. Do you hear? Surely not, Papa. Ma loved you so much, and now she's laid to rest in the cemetery. We must remember her with love, not this bitter untruth. Howard shook his head vehemently, not wanting to weaken now that his mind was made up. There were times I suspected that you were not my child, but being the kind-hearted man I am, I pushed them to one side. But how can I ignore the affection between them in those letters? I gave her everything to make her comfortable. How could she do this to me? I raised you for that paltry specimen, Liam. Morag was in tears as Howard raged. Part of her longed for a comforting embrace from him, telling her that everything would be okay and they would get through the shocking discovery together. But she also felt hurt, and unexpectedly, something else. Curious about who this stranger was. She wanted to know more, but she had known Howard Kelly all her life as her father. The confusion was overwhelming, and as she looked down at one of the letters, still in her hand, her tears dropped onto the paper, smudging the ink. Don't think I'll be swayed by this display of crying, Howard muttered, suddenly releasing her arm as though he couldn't bear to be near her. He looked into her eyes and shook his head. Morag looked so similar to his late wife that it was almost as if she had come back to life to taunt him, and he raised his hand to strike her. Get out of my house, Orla! Go, never let me see you again. Papa, I'm not Orla. It's me, Morag, your daughter. Morag wondered for one terrifying moment whether the shock had driven her papa insane. Howard shook his head again, but this time his expression was stubborn. You are not my daughter, and you never will be. I cannot live with the evidence of her betrayal in my house, rubbing my nose in it every day as if I were a fool. I gave her a life of luxury, but she had the gall to continue writing to some ruffian as though they were great friends. He snatched the letters back and threw them into the air, so they scattered like leaves in the fall. Please don't do this to me, Papa, she begged him. You are the only father that I know. Forget about everything they wrote, she pleaded. But Howard wasn't interested in anything that Morag was saying. He strode back into his study as she gathered up the letters, hastily hiding them in her apron pocket in case one of the maids came across them. He appeared again a moment later, carrying a small leather pouch. You have 1 week to leave Chesterfield Villa. I don't care where you go as long as you are no longer under my roof. You can go and look for Mr. Murphy for all I care." He handed her the pouch, not meeting her eye. "Are you so ashamed of me that you won't even look at me? Can you not find it in your heart to love me like the daughter I always was? None of this was my fault, but you are punishing me as if it is. Nobody ever needs to know about this except us." Morag dashed away her tears and looked up at him. "Just leave," Howard snapped, his expression as hard as granite. He was not just angry that Orla lied to him and made him raise a child that wasn't his, but that she had kept in touch with Liam and was fond of him until her death. Howard was pained because the woman he had loved had betrayed him, and at the age of 62, he had nothing to show from his 2 marriages but an empty, bitter future. "But where will I go?" Morag felt a wave of terror wash over her as she realized what her father was saying. "I have no skills to find a job and nowhere to go. Please be merciful, Papa." She couldn't understand how quickly Howard had lost all fatherly love and affection for her and turned into a man with so much hatred in his heart. Morag knew that her mother had done wrong, but wanted to believe that it wasn't done with malice. Orla Kelly was known by everyone to have been a kind-hearted woman. To think that she had deceived her papa was unimaginable, and she was shocked that he would turn his back on her so easily. "I'm not interested in where you will go, Morag. You are no longer my responsibility." He nodded at the pouch. "There's money in there to help you on your way. Maybe it's time for Liam Murphy to look after you instead, although I doubt he's a decent enough person to care one bit," he added spitefully. Morag looked at the determined set of her father's back as he stalked back toward his study, and her eyes brimmed with tears again. Not only had she lost her beloved mother, but now she had lost her papa too, as well as everything she had ever known. "Papa, please don't do this." Her vision clouded, and the floor came up to meet her as she fainted clean away. Chapter 3, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. "Miss Kelly? Morag, are you all right?" Morag's eyes slowly opened, and she found herself looking up into the anxious faces of Sadie and one of the maids. "I think you had a bit of a turn, Poppet." They helped her stand up and escorted her into the kitchen. "It's missing your ma, I expect. It's an emotional day. Let me make you a nice cup of hot chocolate." Sadie bustled around the kitchen, fussing over her the way she had when Morag had been a little girl. "It's not just that," Morag said disconsolately a few minutes later. She waited until the maid had left the room and then gave Sadie a sad smile. "Papa found some letters written to Ma from a man called Liam Murphy. It seems they were friends before she came to Pittsburgh." "Go on." Sadie sat next to her at the large table, waiting quietly for Morag to continue. Although her heart was already sinking, as she had an idea of what was coming next. "Papa believes that Mr. Murphy is my true father." Morag sighed, finally accepting that perhaps it might be true. "He has given me an ultimatum to leave here within a week." Sadie's eyes widened. "He's throwing you out onto the street?" She clucked her tongue to express her disappointment in her master's behavior, then gave Morag's shoulder a reassuring pat. "That's not the worst of it," she continued, starting to regain her energy. "He can barely even look at me and has told me never to call him Papa again. He said Mr. Murphy should look after me instead." Sadie tutted with annoyance again. "I can understand it's a shock, but still, he shouldn't send you away. It wasn't your fault." She paused for a moment. "He's cutting off his nose to spite his face. He was so delighted when you were born, as proud as anything." "I tried to appeal to his good nature, but he's adamant," Morag said gloomily. She sipped the hot drink, but her appetite had deserted her. "I understand, but you have been his daughter for 20 years. Perhaps, if I had a quiet word with him, he might come to his senses. You can't just up and leave. Your poor ma would be horrified if she knew he was throwing you out." "It's no good, Sadie. Besides, I don't want you to get on the wrong side of him. He's like a changed man, unable to listen to reason and blinded by jealousy and anger." Morag dried her tears and sat up straighter. "I'll just have to think of something. Perhaps I could try to become a governess?" Sadie nodded slowly. "It might take you a while to find a position. We'll have to think of where you could stay in the meantime." A woman of your position can't just move to any old place. There might be all sorts of dubious characters waiting to take advantage of you. Morag felt deflated. Unlike her ma, who had worked since she was 10 years old, her own privileged upbringing meant she had no experience to draw on other than helping Sadie in the kitchen and her charity work. I'm only 20 years old, Sadie. I haven't seen the world, and I don't even know where to begin. Where would I go? Who can I turn to if not my own family? Come on, Poppet. Nothing is ever as bad as you think it is. You may only be young, but you are kind-hearted and fair. I can tell that you have more grit and determination from your ma than you give yourself credit for. The Lord will guide you through these stormy times, and it won't be long before you find help. Morag could only stare at Sadie, wondering how the kindly cook had more faith in her than she had in herself. As they talked in the kitchen, they heard a door slam and the sound of heavy footsteps. A shadow fell across the doorway. It was Howard, dressed in the greatcoat he wore for traveling, and he was pulling on his leather gloves. I meant what I said, Morag, he said icily, ignoring Sadie. I've decided to go on a last-minute business trip, and I shall be away for a week. If I find you're still here on my return... He let his threat hang between them, and then turned on his heel and marched to the ornate front door where the coachman was waiting with his carriage. Morag ran after him, choking back her tears as the father, whose love was all she craved, coldly turned his gaze away from her and climbed into his carriage. With a sharp rap on the roof with his silver-topped cane, he called for them to depart. The coachman, who had known Morag since she was a child, doffed his hat to her and flicked his whip, taking Mr. Kelly away from her as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Sadie took hold of Morag's arm and steered her back into the house. This is no time to cry, she said stoutly, giving her a warm smile. It's time to plan. Let's go back to the kitchen, and I'm sure the Lord will give us some good ideas between us. Morag felt her sorrow gradually turn into anger and then determination. Ma managed to make a new life for herself, Sadie. If you say I'm like her, then perhaps I can too. I think the first thing I should do is look for this Mr. Murphy and find out the truth. I agree. At least that way, you can put your mind at rest. I don't believe your ma ever set out to deceive anyone. But why would Mr. Murphy have abandoned her if he knew she was with child? Morag pulled a face, thinking the worst. Maybe he took advantage of Ma and left her to fend for herself, not caring one jot about the consequences. She wondered whether she might find out her real father was someone she would rather not know, but then realized that she couldn't just let the matter rest. He sounded kind-hearted in the letters, and she had to find out for herself. Do the letters give you any clue where Mr. Murphy was when he was writing to your ma? That could be the place you need to head to. Morag brightened and quickly leafed through the letters. The address changed through the years, but then her eyes alighted on the most recent one, and she read a snippet out. The time has come for me to seek out new adventures, and I'm leaving the East Coast. A man at the docks told me there is plenty of work to be had out west, so I intend to travel to Clearsprings in Oregon and pray that I will find a job and a place to call home. There you are, Sadie cried, clapping her hands. I'm not so sure. This letter is dated from a few years ago. Morag gave Sadie a doubtful glance. Surely it's a risky thing for a single woman to travel so far without any assurance of even finding him at the end? If you want to meet him and ask him about your ma, it's the only location that we know of for sure. The other letters only refer to vague areas, whereas this one mentions a town. I expect you'll be able to ask around and find someone who will have heard of him. From what I know, the towns out west are smaller, and everyone knows one another, not like the busy cities here. Morag felt for the pouch of coins in her apron pocket and wrapped her fingers around it. She had no money of her own and, out of pride, refused to entertain the idea of pawning any of her belongings. Her papa had become so unrecognizable to her that she wouldn't put it past him to accuse her of theft if she did sell a few items to raise more money. She tipped the coins out on the table and swiftly counted them. Not exactly generous, Sadie commented. She sniffed again with disapproval at the way Morag was being treated. It should be enough to buy your rail fare and a few weeks in a boarding house if you don't choose anywhere too grand. I'm going to be fine, Sadie. If you think about how many times I've snuck into the kitchen to help you over the years, I'm sure I'll be able to find work as a cook. And helping with the charity fundraisers has given me a head for budgeting. Sadie nodded, pleased to see that Morag was being more positive. And don't forget that fine education you've had and all those books you like to read. I reckon you could even become a teacher, don't you? Morag scooped the coins back into the pouch. As long as I'm careful with my money, I should have enough to see me through. A shadow of doubt crossed her face again as she thought about the journey ahead and how far away she was going. It would have been nice to have a traveling companion, but I'll be okay, won't I, Sadie? The cook gave her a sudden smile. A traveling companion? Of course, why didn't I think of it? Clearsprings is on the western frontier. There are matrimonial agencies taking ladies there to meet potential suitors all the time. You could travel out there in that way. Why would they do that? Morag couldn't hide her shock at the idea. Do you mean the women? There are plenty of single men out west who don't have time to go courting in the nearby towns, from what I gather. They want to find a bride, and the matrimonial agencies help with matchmaking young ladies who want to get married and perhaps haven't been able to find love where they live. The agency arranges it all for them, including the journey. I only know about this because the scullery maid from the Morris family traveled to California and married a store owner through one of the agencies in town. Morag was intrigued, realizing that she had led rather a sheltered life when it came to matters of the heart. I suppose it would make my journey safer, but I'm not going there for a husband. I just want to find Mr. Murphy and a way to make a living to keep a roof over my head. You should keep an open mind, Morag. You are a beautiful woman with a kind heart. In 7 days, you will have nothing here to call yours. Plenty of women your age get married. Sadie stood up and put some potatoes in the sink to peel for the evening meal. Even though Mr. Kelly was away, she still had to feed all the servants. It's only because your pa was overprotective that you haven't started courting a nice young man in Pittsburgh. If you use the marriage agency for traveling west, they could introduce you to some gentlemen who are looking for a wife. Who knows? You might end up with a handsome store owner like that scullery maid I mentioned. Morag knew she faced a daunting task, but the thought of getting help from an agency appealed to her. It would be a good way to meet some other women in a similar position to her. You're right. At the very least, I should go to one of these agencies and find out more about what they do. Even though she was fully planning on finding work when she got to Oregon, Sadie had planted the seed in her mind about romance as well, and suddenly she felt a surge of hope. Her papa might have turned his back on her, but she could make her own way in life, just like her ma had done. A few days later, Morag blinked back her tears again. She was determined not to cry, but Sadie's send-off on the railroad platform had made her feel emotional. Be happy, Poppet. It's what your ma would have wanted. And remember to read your Bible and walk in the Lord's grace. Sadie had gathered her into one final hug before shooing her into the carriage. Her fluttering white handkerchief as they waved at each other was the last thing Morag saw before the train juddered on its way with a hoot of the horn and the deafening sound of the huge metal wheels turning. Morag sat back in her seat and glanced around at the other occupants of the train. Most of them were women, ranging from those who looked younger than her by several years to weary-looking widowed mothers busy keeping their children quiet. There were even older, matronly women who chattered loudly to each other about the type of husband they hoped to find. Morag was shocked. Were they all heading west to find a husband? She had never imagined it would be such a popular way of getting married. Her passage had been paid by Mrs. Broughton's matrimonial agency on Hazelwood Street, and Morag thought back to the meeting a couple of days earlier. She had insisted that she was not traveling west to look for a husband, but Mrs. Broughton had just shaken her head with a tinkling laugh. It costs the same amount, regardless of whether you're just doing the journey or you want to be featured in my advertisements in the Clearsprings Chronicle as well. She had patted Morag's arm with an understanding look. I can tell you're a woman from a well-to-do background, my dear, and you probably expected to be marrying one of Pittsburgh's most eligible bachelors." She had smiled in spite of herself. It was as if the woman had read her mind. "I'm sure you think this is a rather businesslike way to meet a husband instead of the romance you dreamt of. Many of my clientele are the same, but you might just be surprised. I've visited Clearsprings myself, and there are some very charming, hard-working gentlemen there. The only reason they're still single is that there are fewer women for them to get acquainted with than somewhere like this." Morag had nodded, not wanting to disappoint Mrs. Broughton, who had already told her that playing a small part in many happy marriages had given her great joy since her own husband had died. Mrs. Broughton had then explained that the train would leave in a couple of days' time, and the journey would take at least a week, depending on whether there were additional stops needed for breakdowns. "You will stay at one of our favored places for single young ladies, Lakeview Boarding House, which I think will suit you very nicely." She had eyed Morag's attractive face and neat figure. "I know you say you're not seeking a husband, but I'm confident you will receive some inquiries from the advertisement. So, whether you find a job or start courting and get married, I'm sure you won't be there for many weeks." As the train rumbled along the track, Morag thought about her future and smiled as she recalled Mrs. Broughton's parting words, telling her not to discount love, as marriage to Mr. Broughton was quite the best thing she had ever done. Who knows what adventures I might have if Sadie and Mrs. Broughton are to be believed. The thought drifted through her mind with an accompanying ripple of excitement as she watched the landscape change through the window of her carriage. She might not be heading west for the purpose of finding a husband, but finding Liam Murphy was just as important. His actions had made her mother look like she was of loose morals, but Morag was convinced she wasn't. Since Orla had died, Liam was the only person who could provide her with answers, and she was determined to get them, even if it meant traveling across the country without knowing a soul. Chapter 4. Clearsprings, Oregon. Clayton Boyd's eyes snapped open. He could tell it was still the middle of the night by the way the moonlight fell across the dusty floorboards of his bedroom. Turning over as quietly as he could in his bed, he held his breath, hoping that he might be able to drift back to sleep. But a moment later, the quiet was shattered by the heart-wrenching wails of his niece crying. He swung his legs out from under the covers and hurried to her crib in the corner of the room, lifting her gently into his arms. "Hush now, Ruby." He rocked her rhythmically and lit a candle. He could already tell that her fever had returned by how hot she felt. As the candle flickered to life, he could see her cheeks were flushed unnaturally red, and her blonde curls were stuck damply to her forehead. "Back to sleep, little one," he soothed, walking back and forth across his room. Her sobs rose and fell for the next few hours, and Clayton alternated between worry and despair. He had thought that at 2 years old, Ruby would be past the usual baby ailments, but this fever had come out of nowhere several days ago. No sooner did he think it had broken than it returned, leaving Ruby more fretful with each passing hour. She had always been a sickly baby, but now he was wondering if there was something worse wrong with her. "How about we try the water again, Ruby? Ma said it would help, although I'm not so sure." He smiled down at the fretful toddler who was as limp as a rag doll in his arms, but her eyes were closed, with the lids looking almost translucent. "Don't reckon we have much choice, Ruby. It's too far to fetch the doctor at this time of night." He propped her up against his pillows and poured some water from the pitcher into his washbowl before dampening the cloth next to it. He pressed the cool, wet cloth against Ruby's forehead and gently wiped it over her scarlet cheeks. His heart squeezed with pity as she began to sob even louder, shocked by the sudden coldness against her skin. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he crooned. "If there was another way, I would do it, but I made a promise to take care of you." Eventually, Ruby's sobs subsided, to be replaced with quiet whimpers that still made him feel wretched. Dear Lord, if only Diana and Roy were still alive to take care of their darling girl. The thought popped unbidden into Clayton's mind, and he lowered his head for a moment as the grief he thought he'd put behind him swept over him again for a dizzying few seconds. He took a deep breath and straightened up again. He didn't have time to feel sad, and there was nothing he could do to change the past. The sound of quiet shuffling in the hallway reached his ears, and Clayton realized with a shock that it was almost dawn. He had gotten so engrossed in helping Ruby that he had barely noticed the time passing. "Is that you, Ma?" he murmured. His door creaked open, and Eleanor Boyd stood outlined faintly by the lamplight from the main living room of their log cabin. "Has Ruby had another bad night? You should have woken me." "Son." Clayton gave her a weary smile. "Nonsense. It's nothing I couldn't take care of." Looking down, he realized that Ruby's cheeks had returned to their normal color and her breathing was steady and soft. She had overcome the fever, for now. "If only I wasn't so useless with this stupid injury, I could have seen to her. You'll have some coffee before you start work outside?" Eleanor turned and shuffled away, leaning heavily on the sturdy cane Clayton had made for her. She had wrenched her ankle a month ago when she had fallen off the ladder in the new hay barn. What should have been a minor injury had turned into something more debilitating because Clayton had been in town collecting supplies. She had lain undiscovered on the dirt floor for almost 3 hours, and her ankle had turned black and blue and swollen to double its normal size by the time he returned. The good news, the doctor assured them, was that there were no broken bones. But the bad news was that the ligaments were badly damaged, and because of her age, she would likely need to take things easy for a few months, or even longer. Although Clayton was relieved it hadn't been worse, he started to see his ma through new eyes. She had always been fiercely independent, out of necessity from being widowed when her 2 sons were still only in their late teens. Seeing her laid up in bed with the splint on her foot had forced him to acknowledge that she had gotten old and frail, almost without him noticing. Her shoulders were stooped, the veins stood out on the backs of her hands, and her once bright eyes had started to cloud. She could get around slowly with her cane, but she hadn't managed to go outside again since her fall, which meant that all the chores now fell to him. Clayton checked on Ruby one last time and then peeked into the small bedroom next to his, where his 5-year-old nephew, Jerry, was still fast asleep. He grinned as he looked at the boy's tousled head and the freckles across his snub nose. He certainly had the Boyd coloring of dark, sandy hair and brown eyes, whereas Ruby took after Diana more with her blonde curls. Jerry would be able to fetch and carry for Eleanor as soon as he woke up, but he was still too young to be much help to him out on the ranch. Clayton sighed, his mood plummeting again. If he was being honest with himself, he knew that the real reason he didn't like to have Jerry outside helping him was that he was worried the boy's high spirits might get him into some sort of accident. He didn't think he could bear to lose another member of his family. Not after the fire had already caused the death of his brother, Roy, and sister-in-law, Diana, making orphans of Jerry and Ruby one terrible night. Clayton gulped his scalding coffee, not bothering to sit at the table. The sun was almost up, which meant he was behind on his jobs and would be chasing his tail all day. He dragged his coat on and hurried outside, his mind already racing with how much he had to achieve to keep the ranch afloat. The next few hours passed by in a blur of activity. After hastily checking that all the animals were all right, he rounded up the 4 milking cows and herded them into their stalls in the barn, where they liked to stand and chew the sweet hay as they were milked. The rich, creamy liquid gradually filled the buckets, and Clayton made the most of being able to sit on the stool and rest for a little while. He couldn't remember ever feeling so exhausted. Even when his pa had died, and he and Roy had labored outside from dawn until dusk, he had still enjoyed sitting on the veranda whittling wood in the evening or going into town to attend church. Now, it was all he could do to look after what was left of his family and keep the ranch from falling into debt. The rhythmical motion of milking the cows allowed his mind to wander, and he couldn't stop himself from thinking about what had led him to these worrying times. It had all started one fateful day the previous summer, when his neighbor and friend, Thomas Juke, had invited him to come to the traveling fair that was visiting Clearsprings for a few days. Clayton had agreed, encouraged by his ma. The afternoon had been pleasant. a chance to catch up with the folks from the town who he usually only saw at the market or for special events. The school children were performing a small play, and then he was enjoying a mug of coffee and a slice of cake from the church ladies when Thomas nudged him, pointing toward a brightly colored tent at the edge of the field. "I've paid for us both to have our fortunes told," he'd chuckled. "You can, but I'm not interested," Clayton had said firmly. "I don't believe in that sort of mumbo-jumbo. Ain't you got better things to spend your money on?" Thomas had shrugged. "If you don't believe in it, where's the harm? It's just a bit of fun. I expect the poor woman barely makes enough money to get by, so I just thought I'd help her out with a couple of coins to buy herself something to eat. We may as well hear what she's got to say about us, huh?" Clayton had rolled his eyes and allowed Thomas to drag him over. "I'll go first. At least then I can get back and watch the dancing. The fiddlers are just tuning up." The old crone was swathed in an exotic-looking shawl and had a wrist full of silver bangles that jingled every time she moved. Her eyes were dark, and she looked at him with an intensity that made him feel slightly uncomfortable as he sat on the other side of the narrow table between them. Suddenly, she whisked a silk scarf off the table to reveal a crystal ball, and she rested her hands on either side, gazing into it. "I see dark times ahead for you," she said in a voice so low Clayton had to lean forward to catch her words. "You will suffer a great loss and find yourself walking a difficult path all alone. But if you—" Clayton had stood up abruptly and stumbled back out into the sunshine, not wanting to hear any more, and soon put the strange encounter from his mind, dismissing it as the fanciful ramblings of a charlatan. "She's a fraud," he had growled, trying to forget the chill which had shivered down his back as he recalled her warning. Thomas had crowed about how she had foretold that he would marry a beautiful woman within a year, but Clayton refused to divulge what she had told him, which had made Thomas sulk until the lively music and dancing into the night restored his usual good humor. The cow fidgeted, lifting her hind leg and wrenching Clayton back to the present. He realized that his mind had been so preoccupied with the past that he had continued to milk her after there was nothing left in her udder. "I'm sorry, Flora," he muttered, rubbing her flank to calm her down again. He stood up slowly and stretched the aching muscles in his back, but just one look around at his surroundings swept him into the past again. The new green wood of the hay barn he had hastily constructed before the snows of last winter was still as raw as his memories. 3 weeks after his visit to the fair, Clayton had headed off to bed before everyone else. He was going to ride up to the mountain pastures in the morning to check the cattle they took up there to graze on the lush summer grass, and it would be an early start. He had been out in the sun all day and fell fast asleep almost before his head hit the pillow. The next thing he knew, he was ripped from his sleep by the shocking sound of screams. The dark sky was illuminated with a sickly orange glow, and as he'd raced outside, he'd realized the hay barn was on fire. The flames had gobbled up the tinder-dry hay, and the heat was so intense he couldn't get near enough to rescue Roy and Diana, who had already gone in with buckets of water to try and extinguish the flames. It was only the following morning, as a rainstorm had put the fire out, leaving just charred, smoldering remains, that Clayton recalled the fortune-teller's dire prediction. She had been right. He had lost his dear brother and sister-in-law, and the weight of guilt and grief had settled over him like a stifling blanket. Clayton shook his head to rid himself of the memories. The fire had been months ago, and he knew that he had to look to the future for the sake of Ruby and Jerry. Fall, then Christmas, had come and gone. With his ma's help, they had been getting by, but since her accident, he had been struggling even more than usual. He was determined to care for his niece and nephew. In fact, a week after the terrible night of the barn fire, he had ridden to his favorite spot on the ranch and fallen to his knees, promising the Lord that he would never let them down. He would raise them as if they were his own and give them the love they so badly needed to get over their tragedy. But now, 8 months later, he was beginning to doubt himself. How can I raise the children if I can barely look after myself and Ma? The harsh thought rattled through his mind as he let the cows back out and carried the milk to the dairy. Is it any wonder Rosemary turned me down? Clayton hurried through the rest of his jobs, keeping an eye on the sun. By the time it was high overhead, his stomach was rumbling, and he knew he needed to eat something before saddling up to check all the fences. Right on cue, he saw Jerry appear on the veranda. The boy raised his arms and waved vigorously. "Are you coming to eat lunch, Uncle Clayton?" he called. "Grandma said you better had, else she'll come after you with her cane." Jerry gave him a gap-toothed grin and charged across the dusty yard to fall into step next to him. "Can't I come with you to check the fences, Uncle? I promise I'll be good." Clayton looked down at Jerry's wide brown eyes, which were full of hope, feeling his resolve weaken. But just as he was about to agree, the image of the two simple wooden crosses up on the hill that marked Roy and Diana's final resting place filled his mind again. "I'm sorry, Jerry. I've got too much to do, and you'll just get in my way," he said gruffly. The boy's face fell, and he kicked his boot in the dust. "I bet Pa would have let me," Jerry mumbled under his breath before walking quickly back to the veranda. Clayton sighed. He couldn't seem to get anything right. Perhaps it was time to pay more heed to what his ma had suggested and consider looking for a wife. He sighed again, feeling his heart sink. Could he really take a wife when his heart still belonged to Rosemary? He didn't think so. Chapter 5. Clearsprings, Oregon. Eleanor watched her son thoughtfully as he ate his roast meat and vegetables. He seemed even more distracted than usual, and her attempts to draw him into conversation had failed. She wished there was something she could say to ease his worries, but it was as if he had built a wall around his heart since the fire. "Della Juke called while you were out yesterday," she said hesitantly. "They were disappointed you couldn't go over there last week." "Too busy," Clayton muttered. He rubbed his eyes and stifled a yawn. With a belly full of food, it was tempting to take a nap in the armchair for 10 minutes, but he had to keep going. "Maybe when things quieten down a bit," he added, noticing his ma's expression. He knew Thomas was disappointed that they hardly saw each other anymore. It wasn't his intention to be a bad friend, but he just couldn't find the time or energy to be sociable these days. "Shall I cut your hair for you tonight?" Eleanor was trying to be tactful, and Clayton had the grace to give her an apologetic look. "I know I've let things go a bit, Ma. Just give me a chance. I'll get myself together soon enough." He stood up and took his plate to the side. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see himself in the mirror, and he grimaced. His hair was long on his collar, and his beard bushier than he usually liked it. What with that and the ragged collar on his shirt, he knew he looked disheveled. The dark circles under his eyes only added to the sense that he was neglecting himself. "It won't take me longer than a few minutes, so don't worry about me standing for that long to do it. I can't spend the rest of my life putting my leg up, no matter what the doctor said." Clayton ran a hand through his hair, trying to smooth the unruly locks into submission. "At least I don't get any bother from the drunks next time I'm in town. They'll probably think I'm some sort of outlaw on the run instead of a respectable rancher." He gave his ma a wry smile, trying to make light of the situation. "Will you visit Rosemary when you're there?" Eleanor's tone was casual, but she shot him an inquisitive look, hoping he might say yes. "Maybe. It depends on how quickly I get the supplies." Clayton filled a glass with water and gulped it down, not wanting to continue the conversation. "Ruby seems brighter now," he said, deftly changing the subject. "Thank the Lord," Eleanor said. She gave her grandchildren a doting smile as they sat quietly at the table. "Jerry has been very helpful this morning. He peeled the potatoes and fetched the water from the pump for me." "Are you sure I can't come out and work with you, Uncle Clayton?" Jerry sensed an opportunity after hearing his grandma's praise. "I'll be extra helpful." Clayton tousled the boy's hair as he strode past. "When you're 6, Jerry, how about we agree on that? You can learn to ride in the corral first on Lady, and then once I can see you're not going to get into any trouble, you can come out with me now and again." Jerry jumped off his chair and rushed across the room to hand Clayton his dusty hat. "Really, Uncle? Lady can be mine?" He stood up a little taller, his face split by a broad smile. "I'm going to look after her real good and brush her coat until it shines." Eleanor met Clayton's gaze over Jerry's head and nodded slightly. The boy had suffered from nightmares since the fire, and his terrified cries were awful to hear. "How about you clean her saddle this afternoon, Jerry? Your uncle can bring it in, and you can give it a good polish." Clayton pulled his boots on, already worrying about the promise he had just made. What if he gets thrown off the horse? Maybe I should have said to wait until he's another year older. The thoughts buzzed in his head like an angry hornet as his mind immediately pictured the worst scenario. "Remember, I have to make sure you can ride Lady safely first," he muttered. "Don't go getting ahead of yourself, Jerry. I'd hate if something happened to you." He let himself out of the cabin without waiting for his nephew to reply. "I'll practice for as long as you want, Uncle." Jerry shouted after him from the veranda, "I'm gonna be a proper rancher, just like Pa, you'll see." Clayton kicked his heels into his old red roan gelding, Buck, urging him into a gallop. He wanted the rush of the wind against his face to clear his head, and as they pounded across the paddocks, he could finally feel his worries start to recede. The view across Cedar Crest Ranch never failed to lift his spirits, even on the days when it felt impossible to carry on without Roy by his side. He reined Buck to a halt as they reached the brow of the hill so he could scan the land ahead. This part of the ranch lay furthest from the homestead, and he always worried that it would be where cattle rustlers might try to steal their animals. He narrowed his eyes against the glare of the sun and let them travel slowly along the fence line just the other side of where his prime cattle were peacefully grazing. "Looks like at least one thing is going right, Buck, although we desperately need some rain." The horse flicked his ears at the sound of his voice and ambled onward. They did this route so often that there was a well-worn track, and Clayton could let his mind wander, knowing that Buck would take him where they needed to be. As they neared the fence up by the woods, Clayton noticed that some of the posts needed replacing, so he dismounted and tied his reins off so the horse could graze while he worked. Eyeing up the trees nearby, Clayton picked which ones he needed to cut down and then set to work with his axe. "Howdy, Clayton!" The shout rang out, interrupting his progress. He swung the axe into the log and lifted his hat to wipe his brow before turning around with a grin on his face. "Howdy, Thomas. I was wondering if I might see you on your side of the boundary." He reached into his saddlebag and grabbed his flask to take a long swig of cool water to quench his thirst. "I was beginning to think you were avoiding me." Thomas climbed over the fence and slapped Clayton on the shoulder to show he was teasing. "Della saw your ma last week, and we know you've been run off your feet. How's Ruby? Is she feeling better? And Jerry? Getting over the fire?" Clayton sat down on a log under the shade of the tree and stretched his long legs out, grateful to stop and chat for a moment. "Oh, you know, some days are better than others, but we're getting by. I'm sorry I didn't make it over to the potluck dinner. I was all set to come, and I must have nodded off in my chair. Next thing, I woke up and it was almost sunrise again." "I understand," Thomas said easily, sitting down next to him. "You know you only have to ask if you want my help on the ranch. I reckon Jerry might be offended if I tell him you're helping me. He's badgering me every day to come out, but it's a big responsibility looking after them, Thomas. It kinda twists me up inside, the thought of either of the children having an accident." Thomas nodded. "Maybe it's time you made things official with Rosemary Lanning, then?" "I know I ain't seen much of you since Della and I got wed, but I can recommend marriage. It's the best thing I've ever done." Clayton chuckled. "I thought I was becoming a hermit, but you were no better. It must be nice having someone to come home to at night," he added, sounding slightly envious. "Did your mom mention that Della's with child?" Thomas looked as though he was about to burst with pride. "Honestly, Clayton, I don't know what you're waiting for. You've been courting for over a year." Thomas stopped abruptly when he saw the look on his friend's face. "You are still courting Rosemary, aren't you?" he asked tentatively. "No." He picked a stem of grass and stuck it in the corner of his mouth, buying himself a moment to pick the right words. "I really thought she was the one. After the fire, she understood that Ma and I needed time to grieve, and she stood by me. But what?" Thomas felt bad for his friend. As he'd said, Rosemary had seemed like the perfect match for him, and he'd assumed they would be getting hitched any day. We'd even spoken to the pastor, Clayton continued, lost in his memories. I visited her father at his hotel to ask for her hand in marriage. He said yes, even though I was worried he might not want her to leave. Not now, the hotel is so busy, and Rosemary is in charge of all the maids, but he said he was happy for her to marry into the Boyd family. So what happened to make her change her mind? Clayton glanced back toward his homestead in the distance. When Roy and Diana died in the fire, it felt like the heart had been ripped out of our family ranch. I almost wanted to walk away and leave it all behind. But how could I, when Ruby and Jerry needed a stable home to grow up in? My brother Roy was like a rock to me when we lost Pa. I looked up to him, and he was the best big brother I could have wished for. Thomas patted Clayton on his back. He was a good man, Clayton, that's for sure. Took after your pa. Both of them good men of the land, just like you are, too. I made a promise, in the eyes of the Lord, that I would raise the children as my own. It was the least I could do. And Rosemary wasn't so sure about it? Thomas asked gently. She tried to be understanding. Clayton sighed. It's not that she's a thoughtless woman, Thomas. In fact, I kind of respect her for being honest with me. It was just before Christmas. She came out to the ranch and said that she didn't think she had what it would take to raise another woman's children, and that it was too heavy a responsibility. Maybe she'll come around to the idea in time? Thomas thought about his own wife and how excited they were feeling about their first baby, and his heart went out to Clayton. I guess it takes a special kind of person to raise someone else's children, and you should be proud of what you're doing for Roy and Diana, taking care of the little ones for them. But that's the problem, Clayton said, jumping up off the log with a sense of exasperation. I don't think I'm doing a very good job of it, Thomas. Ma's doing her best to help, but I don't want her to overdo it and make her foot worse, and she's not getting any younger. My heart is still hankering after Rosemary, but I think I need a wife by my side if I'm going to raise Ruby and Jerry how my brother would have wanted. What does Eleanor say about the situation? Thomas stood up too. Now that Della was expecting, he didn't like to be away from her for too long, and the sun was starting to sink in the sky. I think she thinks I'm a fool for holding out for Rosemary to change her mind. Clayton picked his axe up, knowing that he still had jobs to do back in the barns. We'd better get on, Thomas. You're a lucky man having Della, and I'm so happy for you both with the new baby on the way. Maybe you should forget about Rosemary and think about looking for someone different. I'm not as lucky in romance as you, Clayton replied, laughing. You always had the young ladies of Clearsprings fluttering their eyelashes at you, and then you had the good luck to meet Della at the dance when that fair came to town. His eyes clouded with sudden sadness. The fortune teller had been right about both of their futures after all. Thomas had been married within a year after a whirlwind romance, but he had suffered a great loss. Come over and have a meal with us, Thomas called as he vaulted back over the fence. Della wants to get to know you better. Maybe she could introduce you to some of her friends as well. I'm sure we can find you a wife soon enough. Clayton waved him off and gathered up his tools, going over their conversation in his mind. He still found it hard to accept that Rosemary had jilted him. What made it harder was that he still wondered if he should have tried harder to win her back. She had hinted that if she changed her mind, she would get back in touch with him, but he had heard nothing more from her. Maybe she was just letting me down gently, Buck, do you reckon? He jumped back on his horse and rode home, already hoping that Ruby would sleep through the night. Later that night, Clayton settled into his usual seat on the veranda. He was dog-tired, but it was a clear, starry night, and meeting up with Thomas on the boundary had reminded him that there was more to life than working every minute of the day. He lifted his feet up onto the railings and leaned back, gazing up at the stars, feeling suddenly moved to pray. Please give me the strength and courage to look after Ruby and Jerry to the best of my abilities, Lord. Help me raise them in your ways, to be good and kind like Roy and Diana were. He waited for the usual wash of guilt and grief to engulf him, but this time he felt a sense of peace instead, as though God had poured balm on his troubles. It inspired him to carry on, and he took a deep breath, deciding to ask for what lay deep in his heart. Dear Lord, please forgive me for my inadequacies and the sins I commit. I do not deserve your love, yet you bless me in more ways than I can imagine. I know I can never replace Roy and Diana, but in your mercy, please give me a sign of what I should do to find the sort of woman who could be a wonderful mother to them. I know it's too much to expect someone who might fall in love with me as well, but the children are what matter. Please bless them with a kind-hearted woman who can give them the care they need. Clayton let the warm silence of the night wrap around him, enjoying the moment of solitude as he tried to imagine what it would be like to have someone to share his life with. He heard the quiet chime of the clock on the mantelshelf and stood up, stretching. It was time to go to bed, and all he could do was leave his inner hopes in the hands of the Lord. "Good night, son," Eleanor called from her bedroom as she heard him taking his coffee mug to the kitchen. "I've left the Clearsprings Chronicle on the table for you. There's a cattle sale advertised, with buyers coming from away. It could be a good chance to earn some money before winter. Have a look." "Good night, Ma, and thanks for letting me know." Clayton picked up the local newspaper and flicked through to the advertisements. Grand cattle sale? He quickly read the advert, thinking about which animals would earn him the most money. Eleanor was right. If they sold well, it would bring in some much-needed income. Just as he was about to put the newspaper away, another advertisement caught his eye, and he paused to read it. Mrs. Broughton's matrimonial agency is delighted to announce a select group of young ladies who are seeking marriage to local gentlemen. Clayton dropped the newspaper back on the table, feeling a pang of guilt. How could he even consider such a thing when he had just told Thomas he was still hankering after Rosemary? It was all so confusing. He sighed and lit his lamp to take to bed, remembering that Thomas had suggested that maybe it was time to look to the future instead. "Is this the sign I asked for, Lord?" Clayton raised his eyes briefly upward, and his mouth lifted at the corner in a smile of amusement at thinking it could be so simple. Or am I just being fanciful? Chapter 6. Clearsprings, Oregon. Morag paused from her task of sweeping up the crumbs on the dining room floor and looked out of the window to admire the scenery. She had finished washing the dishes after dinner, and the sun was just setting, casting a soft, orangey purple over the trees beyond the lake. It was hard to believe she had been at Lakeview boarding house for almost a month. She had arrived in Clearsprings full of optimism, but her heart was growing heavier by the day. Her first week had been taken up by getting to know her way about the bustling frontier town, making discreet inquiries on the whereabouts of Liam Murphy. "The name sounds familiar, but I ain't so sure who exactly he is," one person had replied, shrugging. "I believe he came in here once or twice, but he seemed like the sort of man who isn't given to chatting, so I can't say I know much about him," another had said. When Morag questioned the storekeepers and even plucked up the courage to ask one of the barmaids at the busiest saloon, they all listened sympathetically, but could give her no firm information. It seemed that Mr. Murphy was a quiet man who kept himself to himself, and she had started to feel as though she had exhausted all avenues of inquiry. But yesterday, the blacksmith's apprentice, Tom, had waved her down outside the mercantile store. "You were asking about a certain Mr. Murphy, weren't you, ma'am?" He looked bashful as she nodded. "I promise I wasn't being nosy, but I happened to overhear you asking around town. Well, he came to get his horse shot a few days ago, and we got to talking." Morag had felt hope leap in her chest, nodding eagerly. "And it was him? Where is he now? Can you tell me?" Tom had looked apologetic. "I'm sorry, ma'am. It might not be the news you were hoping for. He told me he was leaving Clearsprings that evening and wasn't sure when he might return." Morag had felt all her hope vanish, like snow melting on a warm day. She had come all this way for nothing. The fact that it seemed he had been in town since she'd arrived, but their paths hadn't crossed, made it even more disappointing. "He used to come to us any time his horse needed shoes. If it's any consolation, he's a decent sort of a man," Tom said, wanting to cheer her up. Always friendly and paid his bills on time, not like some of the folks who come out west treating us like fools because they know they're not staying long. She had tossed and turned in bed, barely getting any sleep after hearing Tom's news, knowing that she had to face up to a few hard facts. Liam was not here, so she couldn't rely on his help for somewhere to live. And she had discovered that it was harder than she thought it would be to find work. Mrs. Fellows, the owner of the boarding house, had been kind enough to offer her a few chores in return for reducing her rent, but the money her papa had given her was almost gone. "You've gotten the place nice and clean. Thank you, Morag." Mrs. Fellows bustled into the dining room with a pile of freshly starched tablecloths, snapping Morag out of her troubled thoughts. "All you need to do now is put these on and set the tables for breakfast, and that's everything done for today." Morag was deep in thought as she went upstairs a few minutes later, wondering whether it was too soon to go around town again to try and find work the following morning. After spending her first week in Clearsprings looking for Mr. Murphy, she had busied herself with asking her new acquaintances what jobs were available and would be suitable for a single woman. Unfortunately, the school had just taken on 2 new teachers, and there were no vacancies at the tea rooms and stores she had tried. Mrs. Fellows had thoughtfully put her in a room shared with 2 other women, Abigail and Polly, who had arrived a week before Morag to help them all save money. But that was also proving problematic and giving her sleepless nights. At first, they had gotten along well, but lately, Morag had sensed they were turning against her. Morag paused in the hallway, and the sound of their voices reached her. "She still pretends she's looking for work, even though I can tell by the way she speaks she's never done a lick of hard work in her life." Abigail sounded aggrieved, and Morag hesitated just outside the door. She was desperate to go to bed and get a good night's sleep, but if she went in now, they might accuse her of eavesdropping. Polly chuckled. "I overheard her pleading with Mrs. Fellows for more chores to do. She said it helps fill in the time. Goodness knows why someone as stuck up as her would want to behave like a common maid. Do you think she's just pretending she needs work to make herself seem more interesting?" The careless words stung Morag. She had gone out of her way to be friendly to her roommates, but there was no point in trying to defend herself. It seemed they had made their minds up about her already. The fact that she had failed to find work only made it worse. And her heart sank as she wondered whether the kindly people of Clearsprings thought she was stuck up as well. Perhaps that was why nobody wanted to take her on. "What about Jared Parker's visit? Did she ruin that for you?" Abigail sounded breathless with curiosity, as though she was enjoying every tidbit of gossip about Morag. "Yes, she did," Polly complained. "Yet another suitable gentleman with his head turned by that little madam. Why was he asking for Morag instead of you?" Abigail sounded offended on her friend's behalf. "They always do," Polly replied, sounding hurt. "She's young and pretty and knows how to turn on the charm when the gentlemen are around. I'm convinced she does it on purpose. Every time I have a gentleman caller, all arranged by the agency, Morag makes a point of fussing over them, pouring them cups of tea, asking if everything is to their liking." Morag felt the blood rush to her cheeks at Polly's accusation. She had only been doing what Mrs. Fellows had asked, serving the guests, but Polly had taken an entirely different interpretation from her actions. "She's a disgrace to herself," Abigail grumbled, echoing her disdain for Morag. "Look at her with her pretty face, auburn hair, and blue eyes. She acts so innocent, but I can tell she uses her beauty to make our lives worse." Morag sighed, not sure how to reassure the 2 women she had thought were her friends. At 27, Polly would soon be a confirmed spinster in some people's eyes. Whenever a gentleman came to see if they might start courting, Morag had noticed that Polly became prickly and short-tempered, as though worried that it might be her last chance to meet a suitable beau. And several times, the gentleman had struck up a conversation with Morag instead, as they were confused by Polly's mercurial moods. The shame of it was that when Polly's attention was on other matters, Morag had found her to be good company, and certainly still pretty with her chestnut hair and full figure. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and the bedroom door opened a chink, making Morag shrink back against the wall. She prayed the two women wouldn't come out and discover her. "This room is too hot as well," Abigail complained. "I'm starting to regret being here. Mrs. Fellows speaks so highly of Morag, always singing her praises. It's enough to make me want to request she should be moved. How can we make our mark in the town when everyone favors her over us?" Her footsteps receded again, and the springs of her bed squeaked as she sat down to brush her hair. "Everything she does is to seek attention," Polly grumbled sourly, her voice caring for anyone to hear. "She pretends she's not here for a husband and looks down her nose, thinking that we're desperate to get wed. Yet every time a gentleman calls, she pushes herself forward and takes all the attention on herself. She's vain and selfish." Morag bristled at Polly's judgmental words. She had made it plain to Mrs. Broughton that she wasn't coming to Clearsprings to look for a husband, and she had never knowingly sought to attract a man's attention, especially not now that she was in the delicate position of being a single, unaccompanied woman far away from home. "And the more it happens, the more she denies it," Abigail declared, stoking Polly's anger. "She thinks she's better than us. It's scandalous. For a woman in your situation, especially, Polly, this could be doing you no good at all." Morag couldn't stand it for a moment longer. Blinking back her tears, she hurried into the room, determined to show them that they had gotten her all wrong. "I heard what you said, Polly, and it's not true. I meant what I said when I told you I'm here to find out about my past. You can ask Mrs. Broughton if you don't believe me." Abigail folded her arms defensively, feeling guilty that they had been overheard gossiping. "If you're not here to find a husband, why do you flirt with all the gentlemen who come to meet Polly and me then?" "You're ruining my chances of getting married, Morag Kelly," Polly said sharply. "Jared seemed quite taken with me until you showed up in the dining room, and then he only had eyes for you. He was mine first, and you're going to take him off me, I'm sure of it." Her voice rose, teetering on hysteria. Morag stepped back. The force of Polly's anger felt like being slapped. "I'm doing no such thing," she said hastily. "I'm sorry if you thought I was. Can't we all just be friends again, like when we first arrived in Clearsprings? Surely we can live in peace together, and I'm sure you'll both be married to wonderful husbands in no time." "My mind is made up," Polly continued, ignoring Morag's apology. "First thing tomorrow, I'm going to demand that Mrs. Fellows remove you from this boarding house. And if she doesn't, I'll tell Mrs. Broughton that you're making trouble for all the other poor, innocent women who have come here in good faith to find love." "You may as well start packing your bags now," Abigail said, chiming in. "Anyway, it's obvious you're from a well-to-do family, so it's no hardship for you to move to a different hotel. Polly and I don't have much money, so we have to stay here." "Please reconsider," Morag pleaded. "I'm going to find a job soon. My papa threw me out on the street. I'm not the sort of person you're painting me to be." Polly turned her back on her, pretending to look for something in her sewing bag, and Abigail opened her book and started to read. "We don't want you here," Polly said firmly. "If I don't find a husband soon, I'll be left a spinster, and it's just not fair. If you had an ounce of kindness, you'd leave so I get a chance at happiness." Morag's shoulders slumped, and the tears she had been holding back rolled down her cheeks. She had never been spoken of so unkindly, and it felt as though everyone hated her. Why was life so cruel and everything conspiring against her? She turned on her heel and ran from the room, not wanting to be in their company any longer. She fled downstairs and crept outside to sit on the wooden veranda in the shadows where she could gather her thoughts. "What am I to do?" Her plea came out in a hoarse whisper, heard only by herself. Morag sighed deeply, still reeling with shock at how badly things were turning out for her. In the space of just a few short weeks, she had been shunned by her papa and cast out from her comfortable life in Chesterfield Villa. Her hopes of ever finding Mr. Murphy had been dashed, and now the women she had thought were her friends had turned against her. Speaking untruths about her in such a heartless manner, she was beginning to doubt if she might ever be happy again. Her breath was ragged as she started to weep in earnest, hunched over her knees. She had no friends or family, and her money was practically all gone. "Lord, who can I turn to?" she sobbed. She was utterly alone, and her future was bleak. Suddenly, the sound of soft footsteps caught her attention, and she hastily wiped the back of her hand across her cheeks, ashamed at being found in such a moment of distress. "Are you okay, ma'am?" The voice was gruff and hesitant. Morag slowly looked up to see a man staring at her. His hair was a shade too long, curling on his collar, and his rugged features were etched with tiredness. But there was a gentleness about his tone and the way his brown eyes held her gaze as though he actually cared about her answer. She should have felt afraid, but instead, it was as if the Lord had delivered a kind-hearted stranger right when she needed it most. Chapter 7. "Looks like you could use this, ma'am." The man handed Morag a handkerchief to dry her tears, but the unexpected kindness only made her cry even more. Her shoulders shook with emotion for a moment, and she expected him to hurry away, not wanting to get involved. But instead, he sat down on the veranda step a respectful distance away and waited as she dried her tears. The handkerchief smelled faintly of leather and wood smoke, which she found comforting. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make things worse." "It's not you," Morag mumbled. She took a shaky breath, trying to compose herself. "It's everything else. I've been a fool coming all this way to Clearsprings. Everything has gone wrong, and I don't know what to do." "Hush now. Surely things aren't so bad. Maybe a good night's sleep will help you see things in a better light. Upsetting yourself won't solve anything." Morag shook her head. "It is as bad as it can possibly be. I've looked everywhere for work. I can't go home back east. I can't even stay at this boarding house that Mrs. Broughton arranged for us to stay at after tonight, because the women hate me, but I don't have enough money to pay to stay somewhere different. They think I want to take the attention away from the men coming to court them. But I didn't even come here to find a husband. I just want to find out about my past. But that's gone wrong too. I have nothing left," she finished, looking down at her hands in defeat. Her mind felt foggy with conflicting thoughts, and she didn't know why she was pouring her heart out to a complete stranger. Nothing made sense anymore, but it was as if now she had started to unburden herself. She couldn't stop. Like a river dam suddenly breaking free, she felt all her troubles pouring out of her. A moment later, she glanced up again, meeting his warm brown gaze. He looked at her with compassion, and she felt her cheeks flush from the attention that she was so unused to receiving. "I'm so sorry," she stuttered. Her face felt hotter as she silently chastised herself for the embarrassing revelations. "What must you think? Thank you for the handkerchief. I must go." She picked up her skirts and got to her feet, hoping she could escape before she made more of a fool of herself. "Wait, please." The man had also gotten to his feet, and he took his hat off, turning it in his large hands. "What is it?" Morag didn't mean to sound curt, but she couldn't understand why he wasn't continuing on his way. "If I could help you solve your problem, would you be interested?" The question was forthright, and he looked nervous. "Of course, but how can you? You know nothing about me." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "That's not quite true. I know that you've found yourself in a situation that is making you unhappy, probably through no fault of your own, and you seem like you're the kind of person to want a better future for yourself. Unless I've mistaken what you said?" He opened his arms, inviting her to agree. "I suppose you might think that, from what I said," Morag replied cautiously. "I have an idea, or perhaps an invitation of sorts." She was even more confused. "You're not making much sense." A horrifying thought suddenly popped into her mind. "I'm not a woman of the night, if that's what you think," she said hastily, turning to leave again. The man looked momentarily shocked, and then it was his turn to shake his head. He smiled and extended his hand. "Perhaps I should start again. I'm a little rusty at proper introductions." He smiled and shook her hand. "My name is Clayton Boyd, and I own a small ranch just yonder on the far side of Clearsprings by the mountain. I live there with my ma, but she's hurt her foot and she's getting kind of frail, even though she wouldn't admit it." Morag nodded slowly, still not sure where the conversation was leading. "Well, since we're trading names, I'm Morag Kelly." He seemed encouraged and continued. "I also care for my brother's children because they were orphaned." His expression softened. "There's Ruby, who's 2. She's not the strongest little girl. She just had a fever, and I was terrified I was going to lose her too. Then there's Jerry. He's 5 and a real sparky kind of boy. But the thing is, I'm struggling, ma'am. I feel like I can't stay on top of all the jobs on the ranch and raise the children and look after Ma. I'm worried something's got to give, but I have to keep the ranch going for all our sakes." His words trailed off, and he looked at her expectantly. Morag nodded again, her mind whirring. She had pictured herself working in a store in Clearsprings, or perhaps taking a position in the school. But there was something about the way Clayton had described his nephew and niece that tugged at her heartstrings. He wanted to raise them well, and she could tell he felt awkward admitting that it was a struggle. "I haven't worked with children before, but I had hoped to get a job in the school because I loved to help with the little ones at church where I used to live," she explained. Poor Ruby and Jerry. It must be hard for them to get over losing their parents. "It is, and that's why I think we can help each other," Clayton said quickly. "You mean I could become your housekeeper?" Morag was warming to the idea now that she thought about it. But then she remembered what one of the women in the boarding house had told her about her lucky escape from a gentleman who had said he loved her, but turned out to want her services only as a skivvy, with no hint of marriage to give her security. She couldn't risk getting involved in a plan that might leave her homeless again. "Yes? Well, no." Clayton twisted his hat in his hands again. "I know you said you didn't come west to look for a husband, but perhaps you need the security that being married can give you, so you have a roof over your head. I know it can be unsafe for some of the single ladies who travel so far from home," he added. He thought about the way Rosemary had found the mention of Ruby and Jerry distasteful, and was heartened by how Morag seemed interested in the children instead. "I'm still not sure how I can help you," Morag said, raising her eyebrows. "If not as a housekeeper, then what?" "The thing is, I've given up on the idea of romance because the ranch and the children are more important. I don't really need a wife, but I need help so I can keep the ranch going. And Ruby and Jerry need the steady presence of a kind-hearted woman in their lives. They need someone who isn't going to vanish if things get challenging. The way I see it, taking a wife would be best for them and you." Morag blinked, thinking she hadn't heard him right. "What are you saying?" "What I'm saying. I mean, what I'm asking." Clayton took a deep breath. "Will you marry me, Miss Kelly?" He stepped closer and laid his hat on the rail, reaching out to take her hand. "I know it's unconventional. Perhaps we could call it a marriage of convenience, if you prefer to think of it that way. We can still be a great help to one another, even if there's no love involved." Morag looked up at him, her thoughts skittering wildly through her mind. She opened her mouth to say that it couldn't possibly work, but then realized he was the only person who had shown her a shred of kindness in her time of need. She forced herself to think more rationally about Clayton's proposal. There was no love between them, but it was a practical arrangement that would ensure he got the help he needed while she would have the security of having a place to call home. It wasn't a bad idea, especially as she had no other option. I agree, Mr. Boyd. We can be a help to one another. You'll give me a home, and in return, I promise I will do my best for the children." They both looked at each other in shock. Neither one of them expected that such a dramatic turn of events would have unfolded on a quiet evening under the rising moon. The wedding ceremony the following morning was short and businesslike. Not at all how Clayton had pictured it in his mind when he had imagined it would be Rosemary Lanning by his side. He felt a pang of regret for what might have been, until he recalled that it had been the same pastor who had given him words of encouragement after the barn fire, approving of his vow to put the children's welfare at the center of his life. He was doing the right thing. Ruby and Jerry needed a mother figure, even if it meant he was ending his chance of ever reconciling with Rosemary. He risked a glance at Morag. She was wearing a blue shawl, which looked most becoming with her strawberry blonde hair, and her expression was one of placid acceptance as she followed the pastor's prompts. He wondered whether she was also regretting a lost love, and then pushed the thought away. They had a lot to learn about each other. But romance had no place in their relationship, and he would only be disappointed if he hoped it might happen one day. They had agreed on a marriage of convenience, and it wouldn't be fair on Morag to change the agreement. "I pronounce you man and wife," the pastor said, snapping his prayer book closed. He nodded at Clayton, and then his gaze slid beyond them at the sound of another wagon pulling up outside with the next couple needing his ministry. Clayton and Morag exchanged an awkward smile, and he offered her his arm to walk down the aisle and back out into the sunshine. They were married, and now they had a lifetime ahead to discover whether it would be for better or worse, in sickness or health. They each privately wished it might be something tolerable at the very minimum. "We'll collect your bag from the boarding house and then head on home," Clayton said. He helped her up into the wagon, noticing that his hands almost met around her waist. She was so slim. She didn't have the same buxom curves as Rosemary, but Clayton observed that several men turned to stare with open admiration as their wagon rumbled through the dusty streets. He had to concede that Morag was an attractive young woman, but in a less flamboyant way than Rosemary, even though he knew he couldn't think of her in that way. "Have you been keeping secrets from us?" Abigail asked curiously, as Morag packed her small carpetbag back at Lakeview boarding house. "I told you she would be the first of us to marry, in spite of saying she didn't want a husband," Polly said in her characteristic manner. "We met last night," Morag replied calmly. She was still wary of them from their cruel words the night before, and didn't want to reveal how startled she still felt about the speed of her marriage. Abigail looked shocked and slightly envious. "You're so lucky." Polly sighed and hung her head. "If only I could be so fortunate." Now that she knew that Morag wasn't marrying Jared, it was as if all the anger had gone out of her. "I'm sorry about what I said to you, Morag. I don't hate you. I'm just frustrated by the lack of good men coming my way. Will you forgive me? We could all benefit by staying friends, I think." "Of course," Morag cried, throwing her arms around Polly's shoulders to give her a hug. "It's only thanks to you two that I managed to last this long in Clearsprings." She picked her bag up, ready to leave. "I'm sure you will both find wonderful husbands very soon. Abigail, you look so beautiful when your hair is in ringlets. Why don't you fix your hair like that next time you have a gentleman caller?" "Do you think so?" Abigail stood up to admire herself in front of the mirror, instantly looking happier. Morag nodded. "Definitely. And I meant to tell you, Polly, I overheard Jared telling Mrs. Fellows that he thought you looked very attractive in your green dress. Also, he happened to mention that he likes fruitcake. Maybe you should offer to bake him one next time he comes to visit." Polly burst out laughing. "I do believe you're matchmaking. I will certainly take your comments to heart." She suddenly looked coy. "Actually, a note came this morning from Jared while you were out. He said he would like to take me for a walk by the lake, and his cousin might be coming too, as he heard that Abigail is seeking a husband." The three of them hugged, and she was relieved that they were friends again. It wasn't in her nature to part on an argument, and they agreed to meet up at the tea shop the next time she came into town. "Goodbye, and take care." Morag waved to them both from her seat in the wagon, and Clayton lifted his hat politely. As the horse trotted on, she could hardly believe that her life as a married woman was about to begin in earnest, and she was leaving the boarding house behind to go and live with Clayton on his ranch. Even though it was a marriage of convenience, everyone would think it was real, and she wondered what expectations might come with those beliefs. Chapter 8. The landscape unfolded in all its beauty as the wagon rolled along the road out of town, and Morag hardly knew where to look. There was so much to take in. After an awkward first few minutes, they had managed to fall into conversation, even if it felt stilted, and the silences between their comments stretched for longer than was quite comfortable. "Tell me about how you came to be on the ranch." Morag hoped it was a safe topic and wouldn't remind him of what he had lost. "I was born and bred to it," Clayton said, happy to talk about something that came easily to him. "It was my pa who started it from nothing. With Ma's help, of course. He would never have achieved as much without her by his side, not to mention raising Roy and me." He fell quiet for a moment. "We breed beef cattle. Folks say we do pretty well at it, too. They fetch a decent price when I sell them." Morag smiled, hoping he wouldn't ask her a question she couldn't answer. "I don't know much about raising crops and animals, but I'd like to learn." She turned on the wooden seat to look across the paddocks on either side of the road, and the breeze caught her bonnet, tugging it off her hair until she tied the ribbons tighter. "This wind ain't helpful. It's drying the land out more than I'd like," Clayton remarked. The ground was parched, and the grass was more straw-colored than green. "It's not usually like this in summer, then?" Morag wished she sounded more knowledgeable. Her genteel upbringing suddenly seemed woefully inadequate for her new life ahead of her. Clayton shrugged politely. "Sometimes it can get pretty dusty. The trouble is, we had less snow than usual last winter, and then it was a dry spring too. Unless we get rain soon, I'd say it's the start of a drought, which is the last thing I need." Morag gazed at the clear blue sky. There wasn't a cloud to be seen, and some of the wildflowers on the side of the road looked as though they were wilting. "The lakes should be full by now, but the rivers have nearly run dry. If we run out of grass to make hay for the winter, it's going to be a problem. I've hardly got any left from last year." He raked a hand through his hair, looking distracted. "It is just like that wretched fortune-teller said, 'One bad thing after another,'" he muttered. "A fortune-teller?" Morag shot him a surprised look. Even though they barely knew each other, she didn't have him down as the sort of person who would seek out those types of dark arts. Clayton pulled a face, seeming embarrassed. "It was Thomas's idea. He paid for a fortune-teller at the traveling fair last year. She predicted he would get married within a year." "And did he?" Morag was intrigued. "Uh-huh. He married Della, and she's expecting their first baby. I expect you'll meet them soon. They're our neighbors. He's a good man to have next door." "And what about your predictions?" Clayton's face fell. "She said I would suffer a great loss and dark times ahead. Roy and Diana died in the barn fire not long after," he said flatly. He gestured at the dry earth and sparse crops in the fields around them. "Looks like she's still getting it right, too. I should never have gone into her tent." She hesitated. "It may not be as you thought. It could just be a terrible coincidence and not that the fortune-teller is right." "Why would you say that?" "She said bad luck would come, and it did." Clayton shot back, looking agitated. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have mentioned it," he added after a beat, looking apologetic. "Maybe it's time for us both to have better fortunes ahead," Morag said quietly. She adjusted her bonnet and looked resolutely ahead as Clayton turned off the road onto a narrower track. Even though she had been positive in her comment, she prayed in her heart for a better future for them. She wanted her presence on the ranch to mark a new beginning and happier times. "Here we are," Clayton said as he pulled the wagon to a halt in front of a cluster of barns next to a log cabin. "I'll introduce you to my family." He felt strangely detached as he helped her down from the wagon, as though he was dreaming and would wake up any minute. When he had left for town yesterday afternoon, he had promised his ma he would consider speaking to the matrimonial agency in town sometime in the near future. Yet here he was, a day later, a married man. He hoped she would approve and understand why he hadn't been able to struggle on any longer without getting help. "Uncle Clayton's back!" The door of the log cabin burst open, and a boy ran out. He was holding a set of reins, and he had a wide smile. "I polished all the horse tack while you were gone." He skidded to a halt and gazed up at Morag, open-mouthed. "Hello," Morag said. Clayton offered her his arm, and she took it, suddenly feeling nervous. He gave her an encouraging smile. "It will be fine. They're friendly." At that moment, a woman appeared in the doorway with a golden-haired toddler clutching her skirt. "Ma, this is Morag Kelly." The tips of Clayton's ears turned pink. "We got married this morning, and she's going to be a great help to us all on the ranch." If Eleanor Boyd was shocked, she had the grace to conceal it. She smiled warmly at Morag. "Welcome to Cedar Crest Ranch, Morag. I'm Eleanor. My son is a dark horse, which is why you might find our home is not as tidy as I would have liked it to be on your arrival, but I'm sure you won't mind. Let me show you around." Morag found herself being ushered into the heart of the Boyd homestead and liked it immediately. Although it was humble compared to the grand house she had grown up in, it had a homey feel. Even though she could see immediately that it had been a little neglected. The log cabin was larger than it looked from the outside. There was a sunny living area with the kitchen at the back, a long table to eat at, and a large fireplace with comfortable chairs in front of it toward the front part. Off to one side, there was a hallway, and Morag counted 4 doors as Clayton walked ahead of her, carrying her bag. "That's Ma's room." He gestured to one side. "Jerry has the small room next to where I sleep with Ruby. That one there is a storeroom." He swung the final door open to reveal a small bedroom with a single bed in it. There were dust motes in the air where a sunbeam shone through the window, and a gray blanket folded neatly at the bottom of the bed. "This used to be my room until I moved into Roy and Diana's old room so I could be close to Ruby at night. She's often fretful, and sometimes Jerry has nightmares and comes looking for his ma. That's why I have to be there for him to find me." Morag's mouth had gone dry, and she swallowed. "Yes, thank you. As you said, a marriage of convenience." She gave him a small smile, but his expression was hard to read. She had the impression that he seemed relieved they would be in separate bedrooms. A moment later, Eleanor bustled in, and Clayton slipped away. "Goodness me, we can make your room a lot more cheerful than this," she said brightly. "Jerry, run and fetch the patchwork quilt from the box at the end of my bed, and then you can go and pick some flowers from the garden. We need to make your Aunt Morag feel properly welcome." She patted Morag's arm. "I expect you'll want a few nights in your own room while Ruby's still not sleeping well at night, but it won't be for long." Morag could feel the blush creeping up her cheeks, and she hoped that Clayton would explain their marriage agreement to his mother before the topic of bedrooms became too awkward. "Thank you. It's very kind of you to make me feel so at home." She felt overcome with emotion as she realized this was where she belonged now, whether she liked it or not. She turned briefly to look out of the window, but she didn't really see the view. Instead, she closed her eyes and issued a silent prayer. "Dear Lord, please help me to fit in and not make too many mistakes, and give me the wisdom to know how to befriend the children, so I don't stay a stranger to them. Now then, I expect you'd like a cup of coffee before Clayton whisks you outside to show you around the ranch," Eleanor said, giving her a kind smile. "Let's go into the kitchen, and Clayton can introduce you properly to Ruby and Jerry." As Morag followed Eleanor back into the living room, she heard Ruby starting to cry. Clayton was pacing back and forth, and she clung to him, red-faced, with tears running down her chubby cheeks. "I took her wooden doll off her because it was time to eat, and she's having a tantrum." Clayton looked upset, but Eleanor just smiled at him. "It's perfectly normal at that age," Eleanor said, heading to the range to boil some water for the coffee. "What if it's her fever coming back?" he asked helplessly. Morag stepped closer. "Hello, Ruby. I expect you'd like some milk. Shall we dry those tears? There's no need to cry. I'm Morag." Clayton held his breath, expecting Ruby to shrink back and bury herself deeper under his neck. But instead, the toddler stared at Morag, and her wailing sobs stopped, to be replaced with a couple of soft hiccups. Then she smiled. "Mag," she said in a lisping voice. She twisted in Clayton's arms and reached out. "That's right," Morag said, lifting Ruby onto her hip as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She pulled a handkerchief from her dress pocket and wiped Ruby's tears away. "Let me get you some milk, and then you can show me your dolly." Clayton met her eyes over Ruby's head. His face was awash with relief, and he gave her a warm smile. It was the first time Morag realized how good-looking he was, and she felt a flutter in her chest that she couldn't quite define. But more than anything, it felt good to know that her presence at the ranch had helped ease some of Clayton's worries, if only for a few minutes. "Coffee's ready," Eleanor said. She hummed softly as she poured out 3 cups. It had been a long time since she had seen Ruby look so happy, and she was truly grateful to see the change. By the time Eleanor called from the veranda to tell them that dinner was ready, Clayton had almost finished showing Morag the area around the homestead, and she was already starting to get a feel for what it must have been like when Roy and Clayton were working the place together. Even with her limited knowledge, she could tell that they had grown the business with pride and care. The bones of the place were solid and well built. There were several corrals to work the stock for branding and sorting, and to bring them closer to home during bad weather, and various barns and sheds of different sizes, some for storing hay and feed, and some to house any cattle that might not survive a harsh winter. The horse stalls were empty, other than a cat with her litter of kittens, and Clayton explained that the horses lived outside, other than in the middle of winter when the snow might come halfway up the door in a bad storm. Nearer to the log cabin, there was a large kitchen garden, and a small flock of chickens was allowed to wander where they liked. "How do you know where they will lay their eggs?" she asked. Jerry grinned. "They always like to go to the same places," he said quickly, as though everyone would know that. "Don't forget that Miss Kelly lived in a big city, Jerry, with huge factories and docks where ships from the other side of the world bring spices and coffee," Clayton interjected. "Probably 10 or even 20 times bigger than Clearsprings, so she knows about different things than we do. I need you to be a helpful boy and show her how we do things around here, okay?" The boy's eyes rounded with awe. "I ain't never been anywhere bigger than Clearsprings." He looked at Morag with a new sense of respect. "Will you tell me about it?" Morag nodded. "Of course. I have some books in my luggage that I think you will really enjoy." "I can't read or write, ma'am." Jerry looked crestfallen. "I'm good at catching lady, and I'm going to be a great rancher, just like my pa was." "How about I teach you how to read and write while you teach me about the cows and the chickens?" she suggested, glancing at Clayton, who nodded his agreement. Jerry looked doubtful. "Do I have to, Uncle Clayton? I don't need book learning to help you on the ranch, do I?" Clayton tousled his hair. "How do you think I make sure we're getting the best price for our cattle, Jerry? Or find out when the next stock sale is coming up? You'll be able to help me out even better if you can read and write, so I want you to pay attention to what Miss Kelly tells you, okay?" "If you say so." She smiled down at the boy, who suddenly looked more interested in what she had to say. "We'd better go in and have dinner. I expect you're tired?" Clayton walked slightly ahead of Morag, not quite meeting her eye. While they were outside talking about ranch matters, he had no problem being chatty. But the thought of sitting around the table together and then making polite conversation afterward left him feeling unsure of himself. He had never struggled to talk to Rosemary, but they had more in common because she'd grown up in Clearsprings when her pa had come west and set up the Grosvenor Hotel 20 years ago. Morag was still like a closed book to him. Did she like to sew, like Eleanor? Was she a good cook? He suddenly felt a surge of anxiety. What if he'd just made a terrible mistake? "Would you like to see the puppies tomorrow, Aunt Morag?" Jerry slipped his hand into hers as they walked back toward the cabin. "They're out in the barn. Ruby can come with us now that you're here. Since Grandma had her accident, Ruby had to stay inside with her, but she likes being in the garden when she's allowed." "That sounds like a wonderful idea," Morag replied. Her heart squeezed with compassion for the young boy who had taken a shine to her so readily, even after suffering such a great tragedy. It said a lot about Clayton and Eleanor's care and love that Jerry wasn't more troubled. Clayton strode up the veranda steps, deep in thought about what jobs he needed to get on with the following day. As he kicked off his boots, he watched Morag and Jerry, who had paused to look at one of the garden borders. Their voices drifted over to him, and he felt reassured. As long as the children liked Morag, that was all that mattered, and their unusual arrangement had a chance of working. Suddenly she looked up and caught him staring. She gave him a shy smile, and he nodded back, feeling an unexpected tug of affection for her. Maybe things wouldn't be so bad after all. Chapter 9. A month had passed since Morag arrived at the ranch. Although the days had flown by so fast with how much there was to learn, she could have sworn it felt scarcely longer than a week. Her life had slipped into a new routine that would have felt unimaginable back in Pittsburgh, and she felt a sense of acceptance, which she was grateful for. She might not have discovered the secrets about her past, but she was kept so busy in her new life that she managed to push it to the back of her mind most of the time. Her day started before sunrise, which had been a shock for the first week. She discovered that Clayton was an early riser, and he told her that this was normal on a ranch, especially as they were in the midst of a drought, and he had to spend more time checking that the animals were okay. You don't need to get up and have breakfast ready for me," he said the second morning after her arrival. Morag had given him a firm look. "If I'm to be a wife, I'll do a proper job," she replied. "We had a cook at home, but my ma came from humble beginnings, and I know that she would never have approved of me sleeping away the morning while you go out to work on an empty stomach." Her first attempts at cooking had been haphazard. The stove could be temperamental compared to the one she had learned to cook on in Chesterfield Villa with Sadie. But after a few burnt meals and some advice and encouragement from Eleanor, she was soon producing good hearty fare that, although plain, seemed to go down well, judging by the empty plates at the end. On her third day, Morag had declared that she would take over Eleanor's yard jobs so she could rest her leg, which had been the start of her new routine. After breakfast was finished, she went out to the garden and barns to collect the eggs. Then she milked the 4 cows before tending to the overgrown vegetable garden. Clayton had given her one lesson with the milking cows, but then she shooed him away, reminding him that she was here to share his workload, not to have him standing over her, feeling like he couldn't get on with his own jobs. For the first week, she had gritted her teeth as her soft palms blistered, unused to the physical labor. Her back ached, and she got kicked more times than she cared to admit as the placid cows took offense at her clumsy attempts to get the rich milk from their udders. She kept her tears of frustration at her incompetence secret, brushing them away before anyone noticed and pinning a bright smile to her face as she hefted the heavy buckets between barns and persevered with the tasks that made every muscle in her body ache. But at the start of her 4th week, it was as if she suddenly clicked with all these strange new jobs. The cows lowed gently as she herded them in every morning, standing patiently while she deftly milked them in half the time it had taken on her first attempts. She felt the strength growing in her body as she tilled the ground and watered the plants, enjoying the sun on her back and the breeze on her face. She was even proud of the calluses on her hands because they were hard-won, providing the vegetables and fruits that went into their meals. It was humble work that allowed her to slowly bond to a rancher's way of life, and she started to understand why Clayton had told her he could never imagine living anywhere else. "You know, I don't expect you to work so hard every day. How about taking it a bit easier today? I have to ride out to the boundary to help Thomas mend a fence, so I'll be gone for a while." The cabin was quiet in the early morning. They had finished breakfast, and Morag had persuaded Eleanor to rest in her room as she was suffering from a nasty sore throat that she couldn't shake off. Morag looked up at him from the rocking chair in the window. Ruby was on her lap, babbling quietly to herself, and Jerry was just across the yard within their view, stacking firewood in the shed. Since Morag's arrival, Clayton had agreed that the boy could start doing a few more jobs outside, safe in the knowledge that she would be keeping an eye on him. "I don't mind working hard, Clayton. I promise. That's why I'm here, if you remember," she smiled. "I appreciate you suggesting it, but I'm learning that the work never really stops on a ranch." Clayton shrugged his buckskin coat on and reached for his hat. "Are you sure? I don't want it to feel as though I'm taking advantage of your good nature." He glanced at the hallway, mindful that his ma might overhear their conversation. "I know we agreed it was a marriage of convenience, but it cuts both ways. It shouldn't only be convenient for me. You deserve a bit of time to relax now and again." "And what about your relaxation time?" Morag asked with a chuckle. "I've never met a man who works harder than you, Clayton," he shrugged. "I guess it's just in my blood because I was born to it. I used to go into town for church and the occasional social event, but after the fire, I lost my taste for company." A thought suddenly occurred to him. "I haven't even asked if you would like to go into town sometime. You must forgive me. Perhaps you want to meet up with your friends from the boarding house and see how they're doing?" Morag hitched Ruby higher on her lap and smoothed the little dress she was wearing. "There are a few things I would like to make for the house, and perhaps a new dress for Ruby, but I don't want to tread on your ma's toes. It's her home. She might not like me making any changes." Clayton shook his head immediately. "You mustn't think that way. This is your home. Men knows that it's time to hand over the reins to me and my wife. In fact, I think she'd be relieved if you changed the house a little to your taste. She always used to say to Diana that she could do what she wanted with the place because she'd already had her time as mistress of the household when Roy and I were growing up. And don't worry, we have a bit of spare money now that I sold some cattle. In that case, maybe a trip into town sometime soon would be nice. I could buy some fabric to make a new quilt for Ruby and a rag doll with the offcuts, and maybe a few other little things, which can be a surprise. Morag's eyes brightened at the thought of Eleanor and Clayton agreeing she could make some small changes. It was another step toward feeling like she was building a proper home for the children. Great, we can plan it when I get back tonight. I expect Ma will want a few supplies too. Clayton leaned over and dropped a kiss on Ruby's head, which he always did before going out. It was one of the things Morag admired about him, the way he was never restrained in his affection for his niece and nephew. As he stood up from kissing Ruby, his handkerchief dropped from his shirt pocket onto Morag's skirt. She handed it back to him, suddenly reminded of the first time they had met. "Thank you," he said. Their fingers brushed as he took it off her, and she felt her breath catch in her throat at the intimacy of the moment. He was so close that she could smell the scent of pine trees and hay on his clothes and see the flecks of hazel in his brown eyes. Clayton paused. Usually he couldn't get outside fast enough, his mind overflowing with all the jobs he had to do. But there was something about the tender way Morag was holding Ruby, stroking her soft cheek as she babbled, that made him want to linger a bit longer. "Maybe I could show you around some more of Clearsprings when we go in? We don't need to hurry back. It would be a chance for you to get to know your new hometown a little better, and I could introduce you to a few more folks." "That would be nice. I'd like that." Morag felt flustered as she watched him leave. If she didn't know better, their planned outing together sounded like the sort of thing a courting couple would do. Don't be silly. He's just being friendly, that's all. The thought slipped into her mind, and she felt a pang of disappointment. Now that she had been at the ranch for a month, she realized that Clayton would have been exactly the sort of man she might have fallen in love with if they hadn't already agreed that romance had no place in their marriage. An hour later, she decided it would be a good time to do some weeding in the vegetable patch. Eleanor was still resting in her room, and Jerry was happily playing with the puppies, close enough that he could see her. She tied a cotton bonnet over Ruby's soft curls and took a rug with them, which she laid in the shade of the nearest apple tree with several of Ruby's rag toys to entertain her. The little girl's health seemed to be improving each week, and Morag's heart melted every time Ruby reached for her. The time passed quickly as she wielded her hoe, working methodically between the rows. The first time she had seen the garden patch, it had been impossible to tell what was meant to be there and what was a weed. But now, she was gaining confidence in her abilities and was already thinking about what she could add. She thought back to Sadie's delicious fruit pies and decided she would ask Clayton if they could expand the plot next year to add more soft fruit bushes so they could enjoy more preserves in the winter. The sun was hot, and Morag decided to stop for some water and to cool down. Mag! Ruby toddled toward her on her chubby legs, and Morag scooped her up in her arms, making her squeal with excitement. "Where's Uncle Clay?" Ruby asked. She hadn't yet mastered his full name, but Morag thought it was sweet what she called him. Morag noticed the shadow of alarm in Ruby's eyes as she tried to see where Clayton had gotten to. Even though she had only been just over 1 year old when she'd lost her parents, Eleanor had said that she had been inconsolable for weeks afterward. Even now, Ruby was always more placid when Clayton was working close to the homestead, where she could see him. The tragedy of Jerry and Ruby becoming orphans tugged at Morag's heartstrings, and she looked at the little girl's dimpled smile. She was so innocent, but had experienced the worst loss imaginable, and in some small way, Morag felt connected to her because of it. Having lost her own mother too, and then being disowned in such a cruel way by Thomas Kelly, the man she had always considered to be her father, she was as much an orphan as Ruby, in some ways. The memories of her parents flooded over her, and Morag couldn't help but contrast the love that Clayton showered on Ruby, even though she was not his own child, compared to the bitter contempt Thomas had shown her when he realized she was not his daughter. Her eyes pooled with tears, and she blinked them away. Trying to calm herself, she looked around at the beautiful scenery, hoping to recapture the simple happiness she had felt a few moments before when she had been tending the garden, but her emotions could not be banished so easily. She felt them welling up and knew she had to give voice to them. "You won't understand anyway, will you, Ruby?" Morag stroked Ruby's curls and gave her a warm smile. "I want you to know that Clayton is a true gentleman, Ruby. Even though he's your uncle, he loves you very much. In fact, I'm sure he loves you just as dearly as any father would." Ruby wriggled free and then tucked her small hand inside Morag's, pulling her towards the roses, where she sat down on her haunches and watched two beetles, completely fascinated. Morag smiled. Talking was easing the emotion in her heart, even if it was just the birds in the tree who were listening. "I'm a lot like you," she continued. "My darling ma died from an illness, and I don't have a father now either. Cahul, the man I thought was my papa, threw me out on the street the moment he found out he wasn't." Morag sighed deeply. "I loved my ma so much, Ruby. Her name was Orla, and she was the kindest mother I could have ever wished for. But now I don't have anyone who loves me, other than you and Jerry," she added with a smile. Ruby stood up again and pulled Morag to the next flower bed, giggling as they watched a butterfly dance along the blooms. "And do you know what?" Morag murmured. She knelt down next to the little girl and looked up into the sky, almost as though she was making a declaration to God. "I'm going to give you and Jerry that kind of love too, because you both deserve it. Your parents sound like they were wonderful people, and I'm going to do my best for you, always, Ruby. Even though my marriage with your Uncle Clayton isn't based on romance, I want you both to know that I'll love you as if you were my own until you don't need me any longer." Morag got to her feet, suddenly realizing that time was getting on. "We'd better start getting lunch ready." She sighed once more. "The only thing that I regret is not finding my real father in Clearsprings, Ruby. Who knows where the mysterious Mr. Liam Murphy has gone, or if he'll ever head back here again. Never mind, I have a new family to keep me company now," she added, picking Ruby up again and tickling her. As Morag hurried back toward the cabin, in the shadow of the barn, Clayton rasped his hand on his chin. He had forgotten his axe and returned to collect it, but before he'd had a chance to make himself known, he realized that Morag was talking about her innermost thoughts, thinking that nobody was there to overhear them. As much as he'd wanted to creep away, Clayton had found himself too touched to move. Now he finally understood what a terrible situation had befallen her, which was why she had been so upset on the steps of the boarding house that night. Knowing this, Clayton felt a new, deeper sense of respect for her, and something more. It had taken courage for Morag to come west to find out about her past, and then to agree to take on Ruby and Jerry, and he felt a sudden protective urge toward her. Morag deserved some happiness after what she'd been through, and he wanted to be the person to give it to her. Chapter 10. Clayton smiled happily at Morag as they reached the edge of town. 2 weeks had passed since he had unwittingly overheard her emotional words about what had brought her out west, and he had thought long and hard about what he could do to help before coming to a decision. Last week, he had started making a few discreet inquiries to see if anyone knew the whereabouts of a Mr. Liam Murphy. He figured people might be more likely to tell him than Morag because connections in Clearsprings counted for a lot, and a few folks owed him some favors. He hadn't told her what he was doing for fear of getting her hopes up and then disappointing her, but he was hoping that he might get some answers on their visit today, so he would be able to give her some good news. "I hope Polly and Abigail like those," he said, nodding at the 2 posies of flowers she was holding. "It's a kind gesture after the way they treated you when you were sharing a room with them." Morag lifted the flowers to her nose to enjoy the scent. She had picked them from the garden early that morning when they still had dew on them. "It's all forgotten. I'm just happy for Polly that Jared has proposed to her. And from what I hear, Abigail will be getting married soon as well." Clayton lifted his hand to wave at some people he knew and maneuvered their horse and wagon to a quiet street where they could hitch up and do their shopping. Morag's trait of being quick to forgive was just one of many things he was starting to appreciate about her. Yesterday, as he'd been chopping wood and Morag brought him a cool drink, he had realized just how much her presence was changing his life. It was no grand gestures, but a series of small but significant transformations. She'd started with making Jerry and Ruby new pillow slips from one of Diana's old nightgowns. Somehow, the comfort of the soft cotton to lie on had banished Jerry's nightmares, and Ruby had been sleeping far better as well, which felt nothing short of miraculous to Clayton. Then he noticed that the living room was tidier, with a new rag rug in front of the hearth and a posy of fresh flowers at the center of the table each week, which she picked with Ruby. Jerry had come on leaps and bounds with his reading and writing, loving nothing more than sitting with Eleanor on the veranda and talking about the stories he was learning. And Clayton's clothes had been neatly mended, with stitches so small they could have been done by a seamstress. The care and interest she took in his family was heartwarming. And for the first time since the barn fire, he found himself looking forward to coming back to the homestead after a hard day's work to enjoy time with the children and the gentle rhythms of family life. It was more than he ever could have hoped for when he'd proposed. The more he thought about Morag and watched her settling into life at Cedar Crest, the more he could see that she was a woman of courage and virtue who always tried to think the best of people and looked for ways to make his life easier. She had promised him she would do her best for Ruby and Jerry, and she'd kept her word. But really, she had gone far beyond that, and he couldn't help but feel blessed by his good fortune in meeting her. "Do you have everything you need?" Clayton asked as he helped her down from the wagon. "I have a few errands to run and supplies for the ranch to pick up so we can meet back here in a couple of hours." His hand lingered for a moment on her arm, and he found himself wishing he could leave it there for longer. "That sounds perfect." She smiled up at him, feeling her pulse quicken at the gentle touch of his hand through her dress. "It will give me time to have a cup of tea with Polly and choose some fabric for Ruby's dress." She looked at her list. "And I can get my baking goods at the mercantile store." She watched as Clayton strode away, seeing him through the eyes of the people he had grown up with in town. Everyone who passed him gave him a cheerful greeting, and she could tell that he was well regarded. It felt strange to think that she was married to him, yet still knew less about him than many of the folks in Clearsprings. Will I ever be a proper wife to him? Will we always be separate within our marriage? The thought slipped into her mind, as it had frequently in recent days. She sighed and started walking through town toward the tea shop where she was meeting Polly and Abigail. Although she was looking forward to hearing their news, part of her felt like a fraud. She knew that Polly and Jared were head over heels in love. And the truth was, she was starting to feel as though she was falling in love with Clayton. He had been a true gentleman, keeping his word that he would make no demands on her in the romantic sense. But if she was being honest with herself, climbing into her single bed at night was lonely. Her heart skipped a beat every time their fingers brushed, or he stood close to her. She yearned to be held in his arms in a passionate embrace, but she couldn't tell if he felt the same way. Several times, when he was helping her with something on the ranch, and she could feel the heat between them, the words "I love you" were on the tip of her tongue, but she didn't want to say them in case she saw disappointment, or worse, rejection in his eyes. At least while they avoided the subject, she could keep a sliver of hope alive in her heart that one day they could love each other as a proper man and wife. An hour later, Morag strolled along the street toward the dressmaker's store. Mrs. Wharton was one of the women she had asked about work when she'd been at the boarding house, and she was looking forward to seeing her again. The bell on the door tinkled as Morag entered the store. She saw that Mrs. Wharton was already serving two women who were chattering loudly about which fabric would be most fashionable to wear for a dance at the big town on the other side of the mountain in fall. Morag didn't mind waiting. It gave her time to browse, and she pulled out the drawers containing a myriad of buttons, looking for something that would be just right for Ruby's new dress. "Look, there's Clayton Boyd," one of the women gossiped, looking out of the window and nudging her friend. It was so terrible. What happened to his family? Morag followed their gaze and saw Clayton on the opposite side of the street outside the bank. Suddenly, she saw an attractive woman hurry toward him with a broad smile on her face, which Clayton returned. They fell into an animated conversation, and Morag's heart sank as she saw how close they seemed. "That Rosemary gets all the attention from the suitable bachelors," the second woman remarked enviously. "I rather hoped Clayton might come to the dance, now that it's a decent time since the fire, but we wouldn't get a look in if Rosemary's there. Look at the way she's hanging on his every word." The woman sniffed with disapproval and then turned her attention back to the fabric. "I'll take a length of this one, please, Mrs. Wharton." A few minutes later, after showing the other ladies out, the dressmaker bustled over to Morag. "Miss Kelly? I thought it was you. How can I help you? You must tell me all your news." Morag could feel her cheeks turning red. She debated whether to pretend nothing had changed, but realized that wouldn't work in a town this small, and she would end up looking foolish. "I'm married now, Mrs. Wharton. Thank you for asking, and I would like to buy some sprigged muslin, just enough to make a dress for a 2-year-old girl, please." "Ah, how delightful." Mrs. Wharton pulled some fabric onto the counter. "This is lovely for a little girl. It's very popular, too." Morag nodded, feeling wretched at what she had just witnessed outside. Eleanor had mentioned that Clayton had courted someone called Rosemary a while back, but she had assured her that it was all in the past and had come to nothing. But now that Morag had seen with her own eyes how beautiful Rosemary looked, she could only think that Clayton must still have feelings for her. She had never seen him looking as animated with anyone as he had been just now, and her stomach clenched with an unfamiliar feeling. As much as she wanted to deny it, she felt jealous. Rosemary was everything she wasn't. Buxom, vivacious, and from what she had just seen, clearly still a very important person in Clayton's life. "Who's the lucky gentleman you're married to, dear?" Mrs. Wharton asked as she wrapped the fabric in brown paper and string. Morag tried to smile, but her face felt stiff. "Actually, it's Clayton Boyd," she murmured. Mrs. Wharton covered her surprise well. "I'm very pleased for you, dear. He needs a good woman by his side, especially after those terrible events." She glanced through the window to where Clayton and Rosemary had just been. "Don't you worry about that previous fiancée of his, Rosemary. You mustn't read anything into seeing them together just now. She's just being friendly, I'm sure. After all, he chose you to be his wife, not her." She patted Morag's arm and gave her a reassuring smile before showing her to the door. "He's lucky to have you helping him take care of the little ones. And between you and me, Rosemary wasn't too keen on the children. You be sure and give my regards to the family, won't you?" Morag was practically silent on the ride home as her mind swirled with the gossip from the women in the store and what she had seen. She had been a fool for imagining that there could ever be anything more than a business-like arrangement between her and Clayton. "It's only what I agreed to. Why should I ever have thought he might love me when his heart still belongs to Rosemary?" The thought took root in her mind, and she could barely bring herself to look at Clayton, who seemed puzzled by her change in demeanor compared to how chatty she had been earlier in the day. "Thank you," she said quietly as he helped her get down from the wagon back at the homestead. She pulled away quickly, not wanting to torment herself with the idea that he might want to rest his hand on her arm again like before. "I need to get on with my chores now." She hurried away, and Clayton scratched his head, wondering if he'd said something to upset her. "I'll be late home tonight," he called. "I need to visit Thomas and Della. Would you like to come with me?" Morag shook her head. "Not this time. I want to get on with Ruby's new dress, and I have more weeding to do." She hurried into the cabin before he could reply. By the time Clayton returned home and unsaddled his horse, it was gone 10 o'clock at night, and the cabin was in darkness other than a candle in the window, so he could see his way across the yard. He had hoped that Morag would still be awake, and they could sit on the veranda and look at the stars. He walked into the kitchen and saw that she had left him a plate of stew and potatoes on the top of the stove in her usual thoughtful way. He ate it quickly and then retired to his room. There was another busy day ahead tomorrow. The moonlight crept across the floorboards in a silvery glow, and Clayton tossed and turned in his bed. Seeing Rosemary in town had caught him off guard and stirred up old memories that he wanted to put behind him. Suddenly, he heard the sound of soft footsteps coming from a little way outside his bedroom window. He sat bolt upright, gripped with a sudden fear that Jerry's nightmares had returned, but with the added danger that he was sleepwalking. He scrambled into his trousers and shirt and then pulled his boots on his way out before tiptoeing along the veranda and out toward the barns. The last thing he wanted to do was frighten him. As he rounded the corner, he was surprised to see Morag standing under the apple tree in the moonlight. She was wearing her nightgown, and her hair hung loose down her back in a cascade of curls, making her look almost ethereal. He wanted to run to her and ask her what was wrong. But as he went to step out of the shadows, her voice carried in the stillness of the night, and he realized she was praying. Lord, thank you for all the blessings that you have brought into my life since coming to the ranch. I am humbled that you have given me the chance to know love as pure as Ruby's and Jerry's, and I pray that you will guide me on how I can serve them and love them as though they were my own children. Thank you also for the times I have enjoyed in Clayton's company. He is a good man with a kind heart, which is plain to see in the way he cares for the children and his mother. I pray you bless his hard work on the land and give Cedar Crest an abundant harvest and the rain we need. Morag paused and sighed before looking up into the starlit sky and continuing. Lord, I pray for wisdom on another matter too. I came here expecting so little, but you have given me so much, and I am content with that, Lord. I truly am. But I'm not sure about Clayton. From what I saw in town, I think his heart still belongs to Rosemary. I seek your guidance on whether I should leave the ranch now before the children become too attached to me and would miss me. If Clayton would be happier with Rosemary, Lord, I pray that you will give me the courage to walk away so he can be with the woman he loves. In your eternal grace, Lord, amen. Clayton gasped as he realized that Morag must have seen him in town, talking to Rosemary. His feelings were in turmoil, and his heart hammered painfully in his chest. He looked across the yard at the bare ground where the fire had ravaged his family and felt the old anguish return over everything he had lost. Although Morag had said he was a good man, he still had no right to ask her to share his bed, not when he had never even told her that he loved her. He thought too much of her to do that, and yet he came to a sudden decision. He would make things right with Morag, but first he had to lay some ghosts to rest. He smiled in the darkness, ready to run across the dusty ground and sweep her into his arms. But when he looked up, he saw she had already returned to the cabin. He had missed his chance this time, and now it was his turn to pray. Lord, please show me the path I need to follow, for my sake and Morag's. He gazed upwards and pressed his hands together. I know I don't deserve more blessings, O Lord, but if you could help me get this right, I will strive to be a better man, I promise. Chapter 11. Clayton, what brings you to town so early in the morning? Rosemary Lanning looked up from the ledger she was writing in behind the desk at the entrance of the Grosvenor Hotel. I haven't even had my first cup of tea yet. Would you like to join me in the kitchen before the guests come down for breakfast? Without waiting for an answer, she bustled ahead of him. Is there somewhere we can talk? Clayton glanced at the cook and young maid, who were busy frying bacon and eggs. The mouth-watering aromas made him feel hungry as he had left the ranch before anyone else had awoken. Of course. Rosemary put 2 cups of tea and some shortbread biscuits on a tray. Let's go out onto the veranda. It's a lovely morning. Once they were settled in a more private spot, she gave him a steady look. I haven't seen you for months, Clayton, and now you're in town 2 days in a row. What's going on? Clayton took a mouthful of his biscuit and gulped down some tea, searching for the right words. I wanted to tell you when we bumped into each other yesterday, but you know I'm not always good with words, and I didn't want to hurt your feelings. Tell me what? A smile hovered on Rosemary's lips as she encouraged him. Just say it to me straight. I won't be upset. I did wait for you, Rosemary, but I was finding it hard to cope with the children and all the work on the ranch. And when I didn't hear from you for so long, well, I figured things were over for good. So I got married to someone else. A woman called Morag. Clayton took another mouthful of tea, not sure how she would react. That's wonderful news, Rosemary said with a big smile. I think we both know it's for the best, Clayton. I enjoy the hustle and bustle of town too much to live on a ranch, and you and the children deserve someone who appreciates that kind of life. I hope you're very happy together. Why don't you bring her to the hotel one day? I'd like to get to know her. Clayton let out a long breath and then grinned. I reckon you're right. We probably weren't as well suited as a married couple should be. Morag loves the ranch, and Ruby and Jerry adore her. He shook his head in wonderment. Nobody's more surprised than me, Rosemary. Ma said I'd practically turned into a hermit, burying myself in work, but now I enjoy coming home at the end of the day to be in her company. Rosemary's eyes softened. I truly am happy for you, Clayton. After what happened, I'm glad you found a good woman to bring the children up with you. She gave him a coy smile. Don't feel too bad about things not working out with us. Now that I know you're married, I might consider courting again sometime. Pa says it's time he handed over the hotel to me, but he'd like to see me wed first. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, and Clayton felt as though a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. It meant a lot that he and Rosemary could continue their friendship, and he knew that Morag would enjoy Rosemary's company too if they were to attend the same social events. The sound of clattering from inside the kitchen broke the quietness of the morning, and Rosemary gathered up the tea things. A thought suddenly occurred to her. Did you say you were looking for a gentleman called Liam Murphy when I saw you yesterday? Clayton nodded. He had mentioned it to every store he'd gone into when they'd been in town, but nobody had any news. I thought that name rang a bell. When I checked the ledger just now, I saw that Pa booked a gentleman in by that name last night. He's staying with us. Would you like me to introduce you? He's probably in the dining room. He's here? Clayton jumped up. I must meet him immediately. There's something he needs to know. Liam Murphy was a stocky man with a shock of dark blonde hair and a bushy beard. His broad shoulders and gnarled hands showed that he was no stranger to hard work, but there was a melancholy look on his face as though he felt he had missed too many chances in life. He was tucking into a plate of bacon and eggs, sitting alone in the corner of the dining room as Clayton approached. Good morning to you, he said, eyeing Clayton up. Care to join me? He gestured at the spare chair at his table with a friendly expression. His voice had the faintest hint of an Irish accent. Thank you. Clayton waited until Rosemary was busy with another group of guests before speaking. I know you might think this is a strange question, Mr. Murphy, but do you know someone called Morag Kelly? Liam's knife and fork clattered slightly as he hastily put them down to give Clayton his full attention. Why are you asking? His tone was eager but also cagey, unsure whether to trust this stranger sitting opposite him. Morag is my wife, Mr. Murphy, and I believe you might be related to her? Well, I'll be blowed. Liam grinned broadly and nodded. You're absolutely right. I think that she's my daughter, but I only found out about her recently. I've been all the way to Pittsburgh to look for her. Are you telling me she was right here in Clearsprings all this time? He chuckled loudly and sat back in his chair with a happy sigh. Imagine that. Clayton held up one hand. She hasn't been here long, Mr. Murphy. But what I do know is that she came here to look for you. He gave Liam a rueful smile. It sounds like your paths must have crossed, but at least you found your way back here again. Liam stood up, leaving his meal half-eaten. Can I meet her? I've got a lot of explaining to do, and I've been praying that she'll hear me out. My wagon is right outside. We live out of town, so you'd better bring your luggage with you in case you end up staying the night with us. I reckon you and Morag might have a lot to talk about. Clayton tipped his hat to Rosemary, and Liam hurried away to fetch his bag. As the horse clopped along in front of the wagon, Liam was quiet for the first few minutes, but then he came to a decision. I expect you're wondering why I've only started looking for her now. His expression gave little away as he looked at Clayton. It was neither apologetic nor defensive. It's not my business to pry, Clayton replied. All I care about is how Morag might feel about finally meeting you. Liam seemed in the mood to explain now that the ice had been broken. I received a letter from Orla's lawyer. She'd instructed him only to send it upon her death. But for some reason or other, it came to me quite some time afterward. A delay by them, plus I was moving around with work a bit, so it sat unopened at the boarding house where I rented a room for a few months. Anyway, there was an address in Pittsburgh, and I traveled east at the first chance I had. Clayton nodded. That's where Morag used to live before she came out here. Did you go to her home? I sure did. Liam pulled a face. I knew the house from way back. Howard Kelly was there, but he refused to tell me anything other than the fact that he threw Morag out. He said he couldn't bear to have her under his roof after Orla had deceived him all these years. Morag hasn't spoken of it to me, but I'm sure it must have been very distressing for her. She did nothing wrong. I know, Liam muttered, shaking his head. Imagine blaming the child for something the parents did. He sighed, lost in thought for a moment. So if he didn't tell you anything, it's just a coincidence that you returned to Clearsprings, is it? Yes and no. This is where I've been living, so I regard it as home now. But thankfully, Howard's housekeeper, Sadie, took pity on me. She overheard Howard sending me away and ran after me a few minutes later. It was Sadie who told me that Morag had traveled to Clearsprings to try and find me because of seeing it mentioned in one of my letters to Orla. I did a few odd jobs for a couple of weeks to earn my rail fare and headed back as soon as I could. You could so easily have missed each other. Thank the Lord that Sadie was kind enough to let you know. Morag speaks very fondly of her. I'm glad she had a good friend in Sadie. Liam gave Clayton a steady look before continuing. Orla was my one true love, you know. She touched my heart in a way that nobody ever has since, which is why I never married. He chuckled slightly. I guess I was a bit of a loner too, which didn't help. So, do you think there's only ever one right person to marry? What if you only realize you have feelings for someone in a gradual sort of way? Clayton kept his eyes on the dusty road ahead as he asked, not quite wanting to meet Liam's shrewd gaze. He had thought Rosemary was his one true love, but it had turned out they weren't that well suited after all. He wondered if it was that which was holding him back from sharing his feelings with Morag. What if they weren't that well suited either? Was it worth upsetting the way things were working for them at the moment? No, I don't think that, Liam replied slowly. I just never found someone who could take Orla's place in my heart, I suppose. Given my time again, I would have tried harder. It's been a lonesome life for me, but I can't turn back the clock now. And as for having feelings for someone gradually, maybe that's the best sort of way? Getting to know them slowly and surely, until one day you realize you can't imagine a life without them being there by your side. Clayton put some light pressure on the horse's reins to turn up the track to the homestead as he let Liam's words sink in. Of course. Why couldn't I see it that way? Liam was right, and the thought made him almost want to smack himself on the head for being so blind. He had been so busy comparing the spark of romance that had developed almost instantly between himself and Rosemary that he had been oblivious to any other way. Yet Morag is the person I enjoy coming home to. He thought about the kindness Morag showed Ruby and Jerry every day, soothing them when they were upset and praising their every small achievement. And the way she encouraged him to believe in himself when he felt downhearted about something on the ranch. She was like the sunshine coming after the long, dark days of winter. She took everything in her stride, gently bringing the family together again to heal after their loss. But more than that, she was beautiful inside and out. He'd been so busy telling himself that they were only together for convenience that he had been afraid to admit to himself just how much his feelings toward her had changed. Are you okay? Liam gave him a wry smile. You looked like you had a lot on your mind for a minute there. I am, Clayton muttered. He clicked his tongue to urge the horse up the hill. He'd just had the crystal clear realization that he loved Morag dearly and wanted them to be together like a proper husband and wife. As they pulled up in front of the cabin, it was all he could do to stop himself from running straight inside to tell her there and then. Instead, he hitched up the horse and took Liam's bag down from behind the seat. "Come this way, Mr. Murphy." Clayton led the way and opened the door to the cabin slowly, wondering if he should have warned Morag or whether he had been too hasty bringing him out to the ranch. "You're just in time for coffee." Morag bustled forward to take his coat, greeting him with a warm smile that made his heart beat faster. "Ruby and Jerry are collecting the eggs. It's looking kinda gray out there. I've been praying for rain. Let's hope it comes at last." Clayton brushed his fingers against Morag's arm, and their eyes locked for a beat. "There's so much I want to say to you, Morag, but first, I need to introduce you to someone." He stepped back and gestured to the man standing on the veranda. "Morag, this is Mr. Liam Murphy. Liam, this is Morag, my wife." Chapter 12. Morag's mouth gaped open for a second, with shock, as she looked between the two men. "How did you know I was looking for him?" Clayton took her hand and squeezed it gently. "I overheard what you said to Ruby in the garden a little while ago and vowed that I would do whatever I could to find Liam for you. It was a stroke of luck that he was in town today. I hope you don't mind?" "How could I mind? This is wonderful news." She gave him a soft smile before stepping toward Liam to shake his hand. "Welcome to our home." "The pleasure is all mine," Liam said with a wide smile. Suddenly he looked serious again. "You look so much like your ma. If I'd seen you in town, I would have thought it was Orla from all those years ago. Will you join us for coffee and a slice of cake, Mr. Murphy? Maybe you'd prefer to talk alone?" Clayton glanced across the room at Eleanor. Eleanor smiled. "I'm going to go outside to help the children and leave you to have some privacy." Morag waited until she had left, then looked at Clayton. "I'd rather you stayed with me. I don't want any secrets between us. Let's sit down together, and you can tell me everything, Mr. Murphy." She helped him out of his coat and put another cup on the table next to the coffee pot. Her heart was racing at what he might say, but she didn't want to face it alone. She realized with a start that it was Clayton's steady presence by her side that would help her deal with any shocks that might be forthcoming. "We came to America on the same ship. That's where the story begins." Liam took a sip of his coffee. "Like so many other people, we were coming to America from Ireland to find work. I didn't know Orla before the journey, but she stood out like a beautiful butterfly on a dull day. The way her red hair blew in the wind and her blue eyes sparkled when she laughed. She captured my heart the very first time I saw her. I couldn't believe she would even speak to me, but it turned out we had a lot in common, so we used to walk for hours on the deck, just talking and sharing our dreams for the future. I still don't understand why you abandoned her, knowing she was with child." Morag could feel herself getting swept away by his vivid words, but she still wasn't ready to forgive him for his actions. "Did you take advantage of her?" Liam looked shocked and shook his head immediately. "No, it wasn't like that, Morag. You have to believe me. Orla and I fell in love during that journey. We swore that we would find a way to be together once I'd earned enough money." He sighed. "We let our feelings get the better of us the night before the ship docked, but it was the only time we were intimate in that way." "So why didn't you do the decent thing and marry her?" "Orla's parents, your grandparents, they had arranged for her to start working for Howard Kelly as a maid as soon as she arrived. I had to go out and look for work. It took me a few weeks, and then I found a job at the docks unloading the ships. My boss was a mean critter. He worked us morning, noon, and night. By the time I had a day off to go and find Orla, Howard had already proposed, and she was betrothed to him." A shadow of regret passed over Liam's face, and Morag felt her feelings toward him soften. "That must have been upsetting," he nodded. "Because I didn't come and find her right away. I think Orla assumed that I didn't love her after all. But nothing was further from the truth. I went with every intention of taking her away so we could be together as soon as I had enough money to support her. But then I looked at what Howard had and knew it would be the wrong thing to do. He could offer her a life of comfort and security. All I had was a low-paid job and one room in a miserable tenement. She deserved better than that, so we parted company. I never knew she was with child." Morag took a shaky breath. Her life could have been very different, but she couldn't blame Liam or her mother for making the decisions they did at the time. The fact that her ma had accepted Howard's proposal was not so very different from what she had done with Clayton, and she knew that Howard had loved her ma very much. "But what about the letters? You stayed in touch," Morag said quietly. "It was finding those that turned Papa against me, which then led me to come west to look for you. I wanted to know more, you see." "Fate played a hand in that," Liam replied. "I bumped into Orla one day, 10 years later. She had just finished helping out at a church fundraiser a little earlier than expected, and it was pouring with rain. It was such a shock to see her. We had a cup of coffee so she wouldn't get wet waiting for her carriage." He smiled at the memory. "Your ma told me she had a daughter called Morag. Oh my, she was so proud of you. Her eyes lit up when she spoke about how bright and pretty you were." Morag blinked back sudden tears as a wave of emotions washed over her. "I miss her so much," she whispered. She smiled gratefully at Clayton as he handed her a handkerchief with an understanding look. "I gave Orla my address, but never expected to hear from her. She was very happy with Howard, and our brief time together felt like a long time ago. But she did keep in touch with me from then on, with occasional letters. And of course, I wrote back. Just with news about my work, nothing untoward. Those were the letters Papa found. I have them if you want them back." Morag poured everyone a second cup of coffee. "That still doesn't explain the final part," Clayton interjected. "How did you know Morag was your daughter?" "Orla's letters stopped coming, and I thought it was because she felt it might be improper for us to remain friends. But now I realize it must be because she'd passed away, because the next letter I received was the one that had been with her lawyer." Now it was Liam's turn to look emotional, and he paused for a moment. "Orla revealed that you were my daughter, and she said she felt it was only fair on you, Morag, that we should meet and have a chance to get to know one another. She said she would like it very much if I would travel to Pittsburgh and find you, which is how our paths ended up crossing. I traveled there as you were traveling out here. It was Sadie who told me you'd come to Clearsprings, so I traveled back as soon as I could." Morag nodded slowly. "And it's thanks to Clayton that we're here today." She gulped as her tears threatened again. Liam looked down into his coffee, choosing his next words with care. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you, Morag. I don't deserve your forgiveness or to ask anything of you at all. But I'd like a chance to get to know you better. I already know that with Orla as your ma, you're a fine young woman, but I'll understand if it's not what you want. You have your own family to think of first." Morag wasn't sure how she felt. Looking at him, she could see that they were alike, and he spoke so fondly of her mother that it was like a balm to soothe the ache of still missing her. She glanced at Clayton and saw only compassion in his eyes. I think I would like that very much." Tears pooled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of happiness as Liam stood up and hurried to her side. "Thank you, Morag. It means so much to me." She stood up and Liam gave her a hug. "We have so much to catch up on. Will you stay for dinner?" Before Liam could reply, an unusual noise made Morag look upward. It was the sound of pattering on the roof, which gradually got louder and louder. The door burst open, and Jerry ran in, his hair plastered to his head. "Pa, it's raining. Come and see." Clayton jumped up and ran to the door, closely followed by Morag. Outside, the sky was dark, and the rain was lashing down, turning the dust into mud almost instantly. The wind had picked up, and Eleanor was sheltering on the veranda with Ruby. "Go inside, Ma, and take the children. It looks like we're in for a deluge. I need to put the horses in the barn in case we have thunder and they get spooked." He turned to Morag. "You stay inside with the others." Morag shook her head. "No, Clayton. I'm your wife. If there's a crisis, I want to be by your side helping out." Clayton grabbed 2 coats, and they ran across the yard together, splashing through the rivulets of water. Chapter 13. The rest of the day passed by in a blur of frantic activity as the storm raged overhead. Clayton had been right. There was thunder and lightning to accompany the heavy rain, and a few minutes after they went outside, Liam insisted on joining them. You'll need help with the animals, he said, not taking no for an answer. I've worked on plenty of ranches, don't worry. We need to make sure the cattle are away from the trees, Clayton yelled. The wind whipped the words from his mouth, so he could scarcely make himself heard. I can't take the risk of a lightning strike. We'll saddle up and drive them back home. The three of them rode to the far paddocks, slowly and surely picking the best route to bring the cattle back to the corrals. At first, the animals were scared, and Morag wondered whether she was being more of a hindrance than a help, but she was determined to do her best. Stick with the cows with calves at foot, Clayton called across to her. They seem to trust you. Liam and I will round up any of the flighty ones. By the time they had finished, the sky was starting to clear a little in the west, and the torrential rain had eased to more of a steady soaking. The cattle were happily chewing on their hay, and the horses had been put in their stalls, so the crisis was averted. Thanks for your help, Liam. It's times like these I miss having Roy around. Maybe it's time to think about getting a ranch hand on the place. Clayton shot him a grateful look, meaning what he'd said. He wondered whether Liam might consider working for them on a more permanent basis and decided to ask him later that night if Morag was in agreement. It would help him out with some plans he had to expand the herd, but also it would be a way for Liam and Morag to make up for lost time as they got to know each other. Think nothing of it. Ranching was always my favorite sort of work, even though I've turned my hand to most things. I'm going to go and get dry. I reckon your ma could use a hand getting dinner ready too, seeing as you kindly invited me to eat with you. Liam grinned and jumped over the puddles, leaving Morag and Clayton in the barn. I'd better go too. I must look a fright. Morag shook out her dress, which was splattered with mud. Will you stay a little longer? Clayton touched her arm, waiting for her to agree. I've been wanting to speak to you about something all day. Of course. Morag dried the rain from her face with a handkerchief and shrugged her coat off. Her hair had curled more than usual in the rain, and the tendrils around her face made Clayton's heart beat faster at how beautiful she looked. I can see how happy it has made you getting to know Liam a little bit today, he started hesitantly. I've done a lot of thinking in the last few weeks, and something Liam said in the wagon this morning made me realize I need to make some changes. Liam? What did he say? He said that sometimes love can grow slowly and steadily when you least expect it. Clayton took Morag's hand in his own. It made me see that I haven't been entirely honest with myself, or you, for that matter, about my feelings. I'm not sure I understand. Morag felt her breath catch in her throat, and her hand tingled where their skin was touching. I asked you to come to the ranch as a solution to my problems, and to start with, it felt like enough. But gradually, I started to hope for more. Having you here gave me the chance to put the past behind me and raise Ruby and Jerry in a proper family again. I kept telling myself that your companionship was more than I could expect, but not love. I didn't think that would ever happen for me. Are you sure that's what it is? Morag seemed about to say something more, but she held back. Today has changed everything, Clayton said, looking hopeful but also worried. When we first met, you were honest with me about accepting my proposal because you needed the security of a home. But now Liam is in your life, and I expect he would be happy to support you. It has been a lot to ask of you, taking on Diana and Roy's children. I won't stand in your way if you want to leave, Morag. He took a deep breath. But I do love you so very much. That's what I've come to realize and what I've wanted to tell you all day. She gave him a tremulous smile, looking deep into his brown eyes. I know that you saw Rosemary yesterday, Clayton. Before I can say anything more, I have to know. Do you still have feelings for her? Do you wish you'd married her instead? Clayton shook his head and moved closer. No, what I felt for Rosemary is nothing compared to the love I feel for you. We would never have been right for each other. I can see that now, because you have shown me what true love really is. It's not going to dances and fine dining in town. It's the way you care so deeply for the children and how you make me want to do my best every day. He pulled her into his arms and brushed a tendril of hair from her cheek. I want us to be a proper married couple, Morag. Will you forgive me for starting our marriage as though it were a business arrangement? Can we start over, but properly?" He could feel her nod against his shoulder. "It's what I've been longing for as well, but I was convinced it could never happen, not with so many ties to your past still keeping us apart." Clayton stepped back slightly so he could look into her eyes. "In that case, can I say what's been on the tip of my tongue for weeks?" He smiled as she nodded again. "I want to solemnly vow that this will be a new start, Mrs. Boyd. One where we stand together, raising Ruby and Jerry and looking to the future. But most of all, I want to tell you that I love you. I did from the very first time I saw you sitting outside the boarding house. If I could have asked for the perfect wife from Mrs. Broughton's matrimonial agency, it would have been you all along." Morag's eyes filled with tears, and she chuckled at the same time. "And I was so busy telling myself I didn't need a husband that I almost missed out on the best thing that's ever happened to me. I love you, Clayton, and I adore Ruby and Jerry. We're already a family, but I'd like us to have more children to keep them company, God willing. Besides, if Liam is staying with us for a few nights, he'll need the small bedroom I've been using," she added, her cheeks turning rosy pink. "May I kiss you?" Clayton asked softly. Morag smiled, her heart overflowing with joy. A moment later, she melted into his arms as he pressed his lips on hers, and they sealed their future in a tender moment of exquisite passion. The horses in the barn behind them snickered softly, and outside, the rain pattered gently on the roof. Clayton held Morag close, wanting the moment to last forever. He had waited so long to allow happiness back into his life, and now he understood that Morag was a gift from God, an answer to all his prayers in the bleakest of times. There would be no more niggling fears about the bad luck the fortune-teller had spoken of. That was all in the past, and he and Morag would face the future together, bound together by love, and grow old together. Of that he had no doubt. "We are so blessed," Morag said quietly as they looked toward the cabin. "I prayed so many times that the Lord would show me a way for us to be together as man and wife, and now he has. No matter what happens, I know Ruby and Jerry will carry the best of Diana and Roy in them. They will grow up to honor their parents without being overshadowed by tragedy because of the promise you made to them, Clayton, and it's the Lord's plan that brought us together." She sighed contentedly and rested her head against his chest. Life might have taken some unexpected twists and turns, but her dreams for a family of her own had come true, thanks to God's infinite love and mercy. The end. Thank you for listening to this free audiobook, and we hope you enjoyed it. Martha Gillcrest writes clean romance stories that sweep you away to when times were simpler, with plenty of love and adventure to entertain you. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like it with a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. That way you will always know when a new audiobook has been added for your listening pleasure.